Before I begin to tell you what happened to me, I will tell you the background. You should know that I have spoken about it to very few people because it has traumatized me a lot, and so I forced myself to structure it so that I can tell you about it and so that it doesn't happen to other people. It happened during the month of May 2019, during my 3rd year, so I was 14 years old. My parents had separated a few months earlier, and I rarely went to my father's house because he was far from my school. I'm a bit paranoid about watching threads in horror movies, and I always feel like I'm being watched from a movie that marked me when I was young, even when places where I can't be seen, and I never really feel safe, even less so now. On May 2, 2019, I was in class, and through the window, I see someone, a tall, old man who's not moving, and he's just looking at me. You have to know that my classroom is on the 1st floor, and that when you are in the classroom, you can't see inside of the rooms. Yet, he is staring at me really intensely. I turned my eyes for a few seconds, and then I look at him again, but he was no longer there, and no more news for a few days. 3 days later, on the 5th of May, I was at my father's and it was night. I had just fallen asleep around 1 a.m. because I have insomnia, and a little later in the night, I woke up, petrified and frozen, as if someone was watching me. Instinctively, and being very curious, I got up, went to the exit of my room, and opened my door, the bathroom being opposite, and I saw, through the mirror, that there was someone there, so I turned around very violently. There was this man, whom I have seen in the courtyard, and he was smiling at me. He was blowing on the glass window, and he drew a man smiling before leaving, as if nothing had happened. Like the first event, I didn't talk about it because I'm a very secretive person who doesn't like to talk about this kind of thing, even if, sincerely, I was scared. I looked everywhere so much that I was paralyzed. My paranoia was even more present. From that moment on, nothing happened. For a long time, I must say. I even started to forget about it. On May 29th, I went to the city because I had an appointment, and I took a bus to go to my mother's work when it was over. This bus, when I take it, I end up being alone for a while because I get off at the terminus. I have like 20 minutes of travel time, and I had a very bad feeling. I don't know why, but the driver looked familiar. I'd seen him somewhere before. When the last person got out of the bus, I told myself that I had to get out, that I was in danger, and I could feel my heart racing. I looked everywhere, and I started to get agitated for some unknown reason. And that's when I understood that the driver was the man who was watching me. He was there, and he looked at me with a big smile, as if he understood that I had recognized him. I pressed the stop button to get off as quickly as possible, but he kept going. He even accelerated, and I panicked. I walked to the very back of the bus to put as much distance as possible. I activate the SOS mode on my phone and use it very quickly. It's a trick that allows me to send an SOS message to certain people by taking photos and audio and even video recordings, so it's very practical. So I use it and shared my location with my parents and called the police without taking my eyes off the driver. Outside, I wasn't in the city at all. I was really in the country and I couldn't think at all. I was totally frozen. I was imagining a lot of scenarios, plus my phone had switched off because it had run out of battery and I was all alone. And we reached a busy road, so I approached the window to knock on it and give a message to the other drivers. A few tens of minutes later, the cops arrived. I deduced that someone called the police and they found us. Quickly, while running, I approached the driver and pressed the button to open one of the doors and ran out towards the police. A few days later, after an investigation, I learned that the driver was a serial killer who raped and tortured his victims, sequestering them before beheading them. Since that day, I have been afraid when I take the bus, and I take it every morning and every evening.
When we reached 10 years old, my cousin and I were allowed to play on the street just outside my auntie's house. There was a busy lane which ran down beside the side of the houses where all the kids used to run up and down, kick a football around, rode their bikes, and generally messed around. I liked it because I had a long walkway to practice pushing my wheelchair without the danger of the main road. And my cousin, our friends, and I spent hours of fun running and wheeling up and down that lane. There was a funny little dead-end alley just leading off the lane, which always had a weird vibe around it. There was only one house at the end of the dead-end alley, as all the kids used to call it. The house was different from all the other houses around it. The others were bright, colorful, and cheerful, full of life, with neighbors talking over the fences with one another, and always ready to tell us kids off for making too much row, a typical slang term for noise in West London. The house down dead-end alley was always dark. Even on a sweltering hot summer's day, it always seemed to have a gloom hanging over it like a dark, ominous cloud. Obviously, we, being merely 10 years old, were banned by my mama and aunt from going anywhere near the alley, let alone the empty, abandoned house. Although my older cousin and his mates, who were 13, hung around dead-end alley from time to time with the sole purpose of frightening his little sister and me with horror stories of the house and its imaginary monstrous inhabitants. Having heard rumors about the dark history of the house, although not knowing anything concrete, the house had the dubious reputation as a haunted house. One typical summer's day, my cousin and I were playing in the lane with our friends. We kept hearing a baby crying. Now, being in the middle of a council estate, it's not uncommon to hear a baby cry, so we paid no attention. However, as the afternoon wore on, the baby's cry became louder and constant, almost deliberate. That got our attention, and we all decided to investigate the noise, so we stopped playing and began to look around. To our horror, after searching for the route of the noise, we realized that the baby's cries were originating from the front garden of the dead-end alley house. One of our friends, who was slightly older, said he would go nearer to have a look. We were all concerned by now, as it seemed obvious to all present that it was a real baby who was in distress, but everyone present also pleaded with him not to do it. But he was, and still is, a very principled, moral person, and his conscience overcame him. We waited for 10 minutes until he came back. He looked awful. His face was white as a sheet, and he looked physically shaken. He told us that he went into the garden, but there was no sign of a baby anywhere. His best mate asked him if he saw anything else, and just nodded and said, "I don't want to talk about it." Nobody forced the issue. In fact, I think everyone was secretly relieved about it. We left very quickly and returned to the safety of home. Years after, my cousin and I were talking to her mom, and she began to tell us about the history of the local area. The subject of the dead alley house came up. We were horrified by what my auntie told us. It still gives me chills talking about it now. In the 1940s, the area where their family lived was way more rougher than it was present day. Lots of domestic violence, gangs, prostitution, and unwed mothers. Also a high pregnancy rate, which is to be expected in some ways, what with the war. Along with it came a fair percentage of unwanted babies. It turns out that the house in Dead End Alley was a baby farm. where women took their babies that they couldn't look after or didn't want to women or couples, and for a fee, they would take these abandoned infants in and find good homes for them. It was said by the locals that the couple running the baby farm were quite an unsavory pair, and there were rumors at the time of coercion and intimidation of young unwed mothers to give the awful couple their babies and neglect and abuse of their young charges. Then the scandal was uncovered. In the 1950s, my auntie didn't know the full facts. The remains of several infant bodies were found in the front garden in the shed where the husband kept his gardening tools. The couple were obviously charged with murder, and because of the number of remains discovered, they were put away for a long time. We don't really know what the truth is of what happened that hot summer's day long ago, but my cousin and I have our theories. My cousin still lives in the same house with her family and my auntie, and every time my husband and I visit them, I still get the chills when passing by Dead End Alley. And our friend who went to look for the distressed baby, who my cousin and I are still friends with, has never revealed what he saw in the garden of the Dead End Alley house.
The first story I posted was about me working as a transporter a few years ago, then moving to on-call pallbearer. Someone had asked me if I'd ever had any other experiences, so I thought I might post a few and see how they are received. If you all would like more, let me know. So, I've always had bizarre experiences and dreams since I was a kid, and even now, though fortunately they have calmed down. Due to how long it has been for some of these, time will have marred my memory. I'll try to keep this as accurate as possible, and sort my stories by houses. A side note, my parents separated when I was around 2 or something. So the stories for when I was visiting my mom will be separate per house as well. I have lived in a lot of different places in my city, and until recently I have had something happen in each of my houses and apartments, from apparitions to just terrible sleep paralysis. So let's start with my first house. I grew up in a small home with my dad and brother. Things were not easy, and day to day always presented a new challenge, from not being able to afford food to rather, let's say, troubled childhood. Anyway, I only remember a few experiences from that first house. One of the biggest ones that stuck with me was during an early morning breakfast. My brother and I were sitting down at the table. The table was situated close to the door that ran into the basement. I remember hearing our cat running up the stairs, and when I looked over, I saw our fuzzy friend beeline it around the corner like a bat out of hell. It was odd for that cat to act like that. He was old and was not that active anymore. Looking up from where the cat turned the corner, I saw a humanoid figure with horns and a hound by its side. Chalk it up to my child brain to put whatever it was into that form. This entity was just there now, watching my brother and I eating breakfast. We just stared at each other for what seemed like forever until I was finally able to look away, scared, and get my brother's attention. When we looked back, it was gone. I never felt safe in the basement. There was always something off about it. But what kid likes basements? I'm pretty sure it's just normal. Following that event, I remember 2 more odd things that happened in that house. They are the same event that happened at different times. I remember waking up at night. As a kid, I was unsure of the exact time. Lying in bed, I opened my eyes to a white mist, or fog. It wasn't wet, it was just there. You could see through it, it was fine, as well as everything in the house, almost as if you had the lights on. I opened my door and left my room to look down the hall, and it was the same. A white mist that allowed you to see as if it was day. I would write it off as nothing, but it happened again to me in the same house. The mist had the same characteristics. Everything was visible. It was there, and it never blocked your vision. It only allowed you to see as if the sun was out. Eventually, we moved out of that house and into a different neighborhood with my dad's girlfriend. Unfortunately, things only picked up for me from there.
In 1999, my family moved to northeastern Oklahoma and built their house there. They own a lot of land, and no one has moved in on it. I'm talking miles of wilderness. When I was younger, I would explore the wilderness and wouldn't think twice about things I heard or saw, and just assumed it was an animal. When I was about 12 or 13, my family moved out to California and took me with them. At about 17, I joined the military and served for a few years to come back and go to college for a bit. So I've been gone quite a while, to say the least. I feel this is important to state, as a lot has changed since I left, including more family moving in. Last month, I moved back to Oklahoma to be close to loved ones and find some work. Upon arriving, I was greeted by one of my uncles who had moved in while I was gone and noticed he was watching Ghost Adventures on the TV, which happens to be a favorite of mine. We began to talk about the paranormal, and he began to tell me some of the things he'd been experiencing. He described that there's been bright light pillars to the north, what would be an old wheat field on the property, and random light patterns to the west, an abandoned property. No one has been there for many years. It's just an old barn and equipment. At first, I just thought there was some satellite work or something along those lines due to Oklahoma still expanding technology-wise. I asked my grandfather about this, and he described a night where lights began to come through his window, so bright that it illuminated the walls of the room. He got up and went outside to find a bright light on the hill just above our house. Mind you, it's all wilderness and trees. Nothing human-related would be this close to the house without us knowing. Helicopters, vehicles, etc. It's very quiet here due to how secluded it is. He said that there was absolutely no noise being made, just light. He also mentioned that there have been large, perfectly cut, and symmetrical holes appearing on the property, with no explanation. I asked a few of my other family members and they explained some of the history of the property, and apparently, one of the native trails passes right through our land. I started to piece these things together and thought that it may not be something like aliens, but something more paranormal. On Christmas, we were all in the dining room getting ready to eat when my grandfather lost consciousness and fell over. He explained that he felt dizzy prior. We helped him and then shrugged it off because he is getting old and he doesn't get around much anymore, so we assumed he stood up too quickly. Shortly after that, I nearly fell over while talking to my grandmother. I felt the same feeling. My uncle who I mentioned earlier saw this and explained how, a few months ago, he found himself outside, staring at the stars, when all of a sudden, he blacked out and fell over, waking up on the ground, covered in blood. He sat me down and explained that things have been happening since he's been there. Earlier I explained that when I was younger, I shrugged things off. I remember being in the woods, looking for turtles and frogs. It had just rained, and I would always do this. I had gone a lot deeper into the woods than I normally did. Deeper into the wilderness, I had found walls built from stone, covered in moss. This makes sense now that I know more about the property. At this moment, I remember feeling a pure anxiety and fear. I remember running all the way home through the trees and brush. What do you guys think is going on?
As some of you may know, I am an armed uniformed security officer in my city. Well, 2 years ago, my company was providing services for a motel named the Knights Inn. The motel was preparing to shut down for a massive remodel, as well as code and structural updates. Now, the motel was previously 2 separate motels, but when the Knights Inn bought it, they merged the properties into one. During nearly 20 years of running between both of the original motels, they saw some rather negative events. This location just happens to be within walking distance from the county jail, so when a number of persons were released from custody, they found their way to this motel. Over the years, murders, drug overdoses, and suicides were all reported on this property. All these dark events left negative imprints on these grounds. Fast forward to when I worked on the property during the overnight hours, and the 3 events during 3 separate shifts I worked, and the one I responded to as a cover officer. The first was on my 4th shift. The first few went very slow and boring. No one had told my staff of the history of the property at this point. Well, the second to last week of operation, I was helping the on-duty night auditor prepare the morning breakfast bar, and the kitchen was in a part of the building where a long shut-down restaurant once was. The auditor was preparing waffle batter and filling pitchers of orange juice when an unopened 12-pack of canned soda exploded next to a service access stairwell that was padlocked from the inside of the service hallway to the kitchen. The auditor's scream was chilling as well as deafening. Well, due to some of the less than upstanding guests they'd rent rooms to, I began down the stairs to find that the doors were still secured and no one could have entered through. I then stuck my finger in a puddle of soda, thinking that maybe it had been overheated or something, causing them to burst. But no, it was slightly cool. As I looked at the auditor, still shaking, holding a small kitchen knife, trying to calm her down, we both heard a loud little girl giggle, but it sounded unusual. Needless to say, we both bolted from the kitchen back to the main desk. 5 minutes later, the auditor told me, "No one that checked in tonight has kids." The following week, and the last week of the location being open before the remodel, I was doing standard grounds patrolling, making sure no doors were unsecured or people were fighting. Just about the time I finished, I got a call from the front desk, calling a code 6 priority. I ran back to the office, nearly tripping on the stairs in the courtyard. Once I arrived, I saw a young black woman with her daughter. Just the cutest little 3-year-old. The mother was crying uncontrollably, but managed to tell me her husband was not himself, that after nearly an hour in their room, he pulled a knife out of nowhere and started wildly swinging it in the room at his wife and kid. The wife said that he hates weapons and wouldn't have had one, so I began searching the grounds for the man. I found him sitting in a dark corner of the courtyard area. He had the knife in his hand and was blankly staring ahead. Once the knife hit the light, I saw blood. I then noticed he was bleeding. I ordered he drop the knife as he slowly started to walk towards me. I repeated a second time. Then on the third order, I drew my weapon and ordered that he stop and think about his kid. Right as I did, 3 local officers sprang from behind me, 2 with their tasers drawn. In a quickly happening display, I heard the deputy officer, then followed. "Taser, taser, taser." The local officers took the man in custody and was having me fill out a statement, when I overheard 2 of the deputies saying, "Want to know what's odd? The room they were staying in had a suspicious death a few days ago, but detectives say it was a drug-induced suicide." The other deputy replied, "Huh, what are the odds this guy went nuts?" I think personally that it's a little odd that a man commits suicide, come to find he cut his arms till he bled out, and then a week later, another man loses his mind, cuts himself up, and is unresponsive the whole time he was being spoken to. The most damning paranormal event, in my opinion, that happened was the first week we closed for remodeling. I was walking around the inside, and another officer stopped in to hang out on his break. I made the suggestion that we sit in the old restaurant and see if the place was for real haunted. He reluctantly agreed. Using a spirit box app on my phone that before that night I thought I overpaid for, we sat and asked questions. For about 20 minutes nothing came through, and we joked that maybe the place wasn't haunted after all. I thought I saw something across the room, so I tried to light it, but come to find my flashlight had died. So while sitting at the table, I pulled my taser out of the holster as we sat in a nearly pitch black room, to use its light if needed. Instantly the spirit box app said, "Yellow gun?" in the same kid's voice. Now mind you that me and this other officer had the same level of training and were fully certified throughout the city. But his response was, "The fuck does it mean by yellow gun?" I then proceed to place my taser on the table and turned its light on. I've never heard so many F-bombs as he stormed out of the room. The final incident I am still unsure of. 4 weeks after the motel closed, I was working a city patrol when an on-duty officer called for priority backup from all available officers on duty. "Sam 262 to Knights Inn. What's the situation?" the officer responded. 4 to 6 persons had made entry into the back building and barricaded themselves into a room. I was the first responding officer just after 3 a.m. and meet with the on-duty site officer. As we were talking and the third officer arrived, we heard 3 gunshots ring out from down the hallway. At this time, we contacted the local sheriff's office about the situation. Within minutes, several deputies arrived in active shooter vests and helmets. They attempted to reach the room as we watched from the end of the hallway. 5 more shots rang out from the doorway, and luckily no one was struck. The deputies fell back to the end of the hallway where the 3 of us were. A supervisor for the deputies ordered 4 to watch the hallways, and the rest took position around the building. We asked what we needed to do, and he replied, "Block the entrances to the property. No one comes on that isn't an officer." So basically we were to keep out impending reporters. SWAT arrived, and the deputies pulled back, and SWAT took position. The whole time the suspects saw the activity from the windows and holes in the door. A lieutenant with the SWAT and public relations officer came over to me and the other guys on my staff, and while asking us what happened before the deputies responded, we all heard from a broken out window, "There will be more ghosts in here tonight if you enter." Around 5 a.m., the SWAT armored vehicle pulled up next to the back of the building, and we hear 3 thumps. SWAT shot OC shells into the room before breaching the windows and doorway, and just as soon as we hear the thumps and see the smoke, 5 of the suspects were being carried out, and a 6th was being rushed out on a straight board to an ambulance. Come to find, the man with a pistol in the room took his 5 friends hostage and attempted to kill himself when SWAT breached. He later died at the hospital, so I wonder if he joined the other ghosts in the motel. After that night, we no longer provided security at the Night's Inn. 8 months later, it reopened as some new-aged hipster hotel. I haven't been to that property for some time now, even though I pass it whenever I work for our South City Patrol. I wonder how the property is, and if the paranormal activity still happens after the remodel.
I work at the Royal Alexandra Hospital in Edmonton, Alberta. Growing up, I was a bit of a rebellious tough kid who always found himself getting into trouble. I'll get back to what I experienced at the hospital, but I first have to bring up an experience in my youth as it ties this all together. I used to hang out with questionable people, drugs, theft, vandalism, you name it. Anyway, we're all at a skate park that resides under a bridge, getting high and fooling around, when my best friend Jesse suddenly starts having a seizure and begins foaming at the mouth. It was terrifying, as in my messed up state, I didn't even realize what was going on for a moment. Then he stops breathing and begins to convulse. At this point, everyone starts freaking out, and soon after, an ambulance was called in. While most of the people split to avoid the cops, I stayed and held my friend in my arms. They couldn't save him in time. I was deeply devastated by the loss of Jesse, but that experience is what made me take my step towards getting clean and turning my life around. You're probably wondering why I bring up this story. Well, last week, a patient was brought into the ICU. He suffered an opioid overdose, but we managed to bring him back with a Narcan injection. But here's the crazy part. Before we managed to administer Noxolone, I briefly saw something. Something that I saw when my friend passed away. A shadow. A figureless, shaped shadow that sort of loomed over him. When Jesse died, I couldn't get it out of my head. Back then, I thought it was something I hallucinated during my bad trip. But now, I think of it as something else. I now believe that shadow to be the demons that we give into. I'm now a man of God, so many may be quick to dismiss me, but perhaps there's another explanation for this. Either way, it's the reason why I'll never drink or touch that shit again.
My brother shared with me a true story of an extremely odd, evil, and clairvoyant man that he and his friends encountered a few years back in Jacksonville, Florida. My brother and his buddies were drinking at a bar when a strange man approached them. My brother described that at first he felt merely perturbed by the presence of this man because he looked like a hanger-on who was trying to butt into the conversation. He said this guy was trying to be jovial, laughing as if he knew what was going on with the guys and what they were talking about and trying to slide into the group. His appearance was more of a nuisance than anything else at this point, and none of the guys seemed interested in talking to the stranger, but he managed to make his way into their circle. My brother said that out of nowhere the mood of the stranger changed completely, and so did the subject matter. As he asked my brother's friend, "If I could give you anything, what would it be?" At first the friend laughed it off, but the stranger let it be known by his tone that he was completely serious. And he asked him again, "If I could give you anything?" The friend replied something like, "I don't know, man, money and a really hot wife?" Well, things got really weird when the stranger admitted how he could do these things for him in exchange for his soul. He then started openly sharing the details of his demon possession, specifically by the demon Beelzebub, and how it was his duty to find humans willing to sacrifice his soul. 1 person every year or something like that. My brother noticed his eyes became blackened at some point, and the most indescribable evil aura was around him. The guys were getting all freaked out, yet still thought this guy was probably full of it. The stranger wanted to prove his ability, so he asked the guy to ask him any question about himself and he could answer it. So my brother's friend asked, "Okay, what is the name of my mom?" And the demon man answered Kelly with an I, which was absolutely correct. At this point, being all completely freaked out, the guys decided to get the heck out of there. What stands out mostly to my brother is the incredibly evil, creepy, inexplicable feeling that he and his friends all witnessed firsthand. I wanted to share this story as it amazed me to no end. The problem is it is very creepy to retell, as I don't like even mentioning that demon's name.
Have you ever known someone who has supposedly or evidentially done bad things, and when you heard about it you thought, "Wow, I never expected that"? Over the course of our lives, we are likely to shake hands with at least one person that has actually murdered someone. Statistically spoken, at least. So with that in mind, we might have been just the luckiest person on Earth to escape a murderer on this one fateful day. I served as NBC defense sergeant in a town called Höxter. It lies directly at the river Weser in pretty much the exact middle of Germany. It's surrounded by hills and lush forests, and judging from the nature around, I was happy to call it my home for 8 years. Over time, I learned that when it came to sports, you could split the preferences of my platoon in 3 groups. There were the team players, who played basically any team-based or competitive sport all the time, like mostly football or volleyball. Then there were the bodybuilders, who took every chance they got to go pump iron, and last but not least there were the cardiacs. Basically everyone who did not fall in one of the other 2 categories. They were mostly out for runs, military fitness cross runs with full gear and such. I didn't like playing football or soccer, and the gym was so small that not even a full squad could fit in there at the same time. So naturally, I went with the cardiacs. After I went with the usual suggested routes provided by my comrades, I started developing my own tracks, based on how fit and well I felt at any given day. The tracks ranged from easy and short over even ground to runs sometimes over several hills, spanning a length of up to 17 kilometers or 10 miles in total. So basically, there was a track for every mood for me. One day in, I think it was June, I was on one of my longer runs. I spared myself the hills, but I still had about 14 kilometers or 8.7 miles to go. My path took me from a barracks through the town into the next adjacent village called Bosseborn, and from there through a loop back again. In Bosseborn I came across a man leaving his house as I was running past. Naturally, we greeted each other, and when I came back the same way, he still was outside and took the opportunity to strike up a conversation. He asked me if I was actually coming from the barracks, to which I replied positively. He then went on talking about how this must already have been quite a run, since the barracks were about 5 miles away from his house. He noticed my dialect and determined that I was not from around the area, which was true. so he proceeded to suggest me some places to visit and some trails for my next runs. We ended up chatting for a couple of minutes before I continued on my way. However, over the years, I took this trek a couple of times more often, and some few times that guy was outside again, and we would always chat a bit about how the week was going and other basic nonsense. I learned that his name was Willie and he was married. He seemed to be a pretty chill guy. A bit, I don't want to say slow, but he definitely came off as kind of mentally challenged. But he was straightforward and even pretty sympathetic. His house wasn't quite my taste. It was situated directly at the streets, there was no garden, and it seemed a bit run down. But that all came as no surprise, given that I perceived Willie to be a bit slow, and in the end, hey, he did have his own house after all. As time went by and I came closer to my regular discharge from the army, I decided to take my runs down the route past Willie's home frequently, in hopes of getting a chance to say goodbye. However, I never saw him again outside, and for me to just knock on his door to give my farewell was just kind of absurd. I mean, I was thinking about it, but we didn't know each other really. We were just two strangers who talked on different occasions for some minute and exchanged names and some pleasantries. Definitely not enough for me to just making a fuss out of my discharge like that. And so I left the army and the town of Höxter to study social science at the Humboldt University in Berlin, starting in October of 2015, without having seen Willie again. After my first semester, I first heard some people talking about Höxter frequently. I didn't think much of it until my old home's name fell more and more often. At first, I thought I was just becoming paranoid from nostalgia. I actually had a lot of trouble adapting to a lifestyle as a civilian again, let alone a university student. When I visited my family, however, my mother asked me if I heard what happened. And of course, she too was talking about my old home. I do not watch TV, listen to the radio or read newspapers, so when it comes to news, I am basically never really up to date. She told me that there was a big criminal case near my barracks with multiple people dead, and when she showed me the picture of where it all actually happened, I recognized it immediately as Willie's house. My very first reaction was me feeling sick to the stomach. My eyes widened and my mother immediately knew that I recognized the place. I believed Willie and his wife got killed, and I was flabbergasted and in plain shock how someone could kill them. I was asking myself how depraved of a human being someone must be to go out and kill a mentally challenged, nice man and his wife. I grabbed the newspaper in disbelief and started to read, and with every word, my shock went deeper and deeper. But for another reason. Willie was not dead. He and his wife were actual murderers. At least 2 women were tortured over weeks and months until they died by his and his wife's hands. More women were supposedly able to flee or got released, and no one went to the police out of sheer fear for their lives, which was very much given, it seems. Willie and his wife were complete psychopaths. Willie was mostly calling the shots and his wife just obeyed out of fear because she would have been his victim if it wasn't for the other women. But still, she had a hand in all of this too. Together they lured women to their homes just to torture and eventually kill them. The only thing that they were looking for in their victims was that they had to have only few or better even no friends or family, so no one would miss them or even search for them. Willie had these women write suicide notes before killing them, and he sent them to their friends and family. His overall goal was to torture the women so much that in the end they would actually really try to commit suicide. He wanted them to see death as a release they would wish for. This guy was... I have seen and heard a lot of horrible stuff before already, but the things he did to his victims were just on another level. He disposed of one of the bodies in the oven, and when bone fragments and teeth did not burn to ashes, he just simply smashed them with a hammer to leave no identifiable evidence. With every bit of information, every single line of text I read of this news article, I became more and more disturbed. I shook hands with a monster. Based on his victims, I myself was never in real danger. I was male, very fit, And if I would have been apprehended, a lot of people would have been looking for me. But just thinking about what kind of person I had these friendly talks with in front of this house. And at this time, there actually was a woman being tortured, shackled up in the upper floor or the basement while I was having these short chats with him. And I had no idea, and didn't, or better said, couldn't help. This still makes me anxious when I think back. Willie, or Wilfried as his real full name was sentenced to 11 years. His wife to 13. Willie actually had an IQ of 59, which meant by German law that he was considered insane and thus not criminally liable. He was placed in a psychiatric ward for the criminally insane. His wife got 13 years because she actually testified and confessed to everything. Prosecution was demanding life sentences without parole for both. And based on what I read about the torture, and the actual planning that went into this with the fake suicide notes and stuff, I myself do not really buy the part of actual insanity. I would want this monster to be locked up for good, which is the total opposite of what I would have actually wished him if we would have met this one time again back then. For months I have blamed myself for just not stepping up to his front door and knocking. If I would have actually knocked on the door, maybe he would have opened. And maybe, just maybe, I could have heard the tortured woman screaming for help, trying to get my attention, and done something. I might have been able to stop this monster and save a life if I would have just done that. But on the other hand, maybe I was the lucky one for not doing that.
This was the creepiest birthday I ever had. It makes me uneasy every time I think about it. I was at a pizza arcade place with my friends and their family. We were all running around playing games. When a clown came in through the doors, and he started doing the usual clown tricks, the nose horn and the flower that sprays you with water. After those little tricks, then the man comes up to me and tells me to come with him because he has a present for me by his van. Me being a little kid, I was really excited. The man took me by the hand and just simply walked me out to his van. Jump in the back seat. The present's in the back seat. Look in there deeper. As I got into the back seat, he then slams the door shut, then hops in the car himself and peels out onto the main road, going about 90 miles an hour. He then says, "You'll never see your mommy and daddy again." I start crying, and then I begin to flip out, kicking his back seat, slamming against the door until the man stops the car abruptly, and then turns to me and says, "Get the fuck out now." I did, and he just left me in the middle of the road. I managed to walk back to the arcade, and my mother was worried sick, and I told her what happened. The cops were called.
Being from the Navajo Nation, I've seen a lot of crazy stuff. Anyone not from here is most likely not to believe me. I have stories about skinwalkers, Kashina dolls coming to life, Bigfoot, werewolves, and some type of winged beast. But I think the creepiest one is one of my skinwalker stories. It's a bit of a read, but here we go. So this story takes place in the early 2000s when I was a teenager. My cousin had just had a baby, and her husband was called out for a job that would take a couple of weeks. My cousin asked if I would stay with her for the 2 weeks to help her with the baby and work around the house. I was there for a few days and everything was pretty uneventful, until the middle of the second week. At night, we would hear someone knocking on different sides of the trailer. Keep in mind, the nearest neighbor was about 5 miles away. This continued for 3 nights in a row. The 4th night is when things take a turn for the worst. The night starts with a knocking, but it progresses to scratching. Worried that someone was trying to break in, I summoned the courage to go outside and confront whoever or whatever was messing with us. I only caught a shadow of whatever it was as I ran behind the trailer. I ran around, yelling at it, "You better run because I'm going to call the police," or something to that effect. It was so fast I couldn't even believe it. As I chase it to the front of the trailer, it runs through the clothesline. This is where things get even crazier. It ran towards a utility post and climbs up it, clutching something in its hands, and begins the most eerie laugh I've ever heard. It jumps back down, dropping whatever it was holding, and runs toward the window of the trailer, as if to peek inside. My cousin was inside, holding the baby. I run to the window and look, and to my amazement, it had disappeared. I run inside and tell my cousin it's gone. Needless to say, we didn't sleep well for the rest of the night. The next morning, I go outside and look at the window where I had last seen it. I look at the ground and see bare footprints. However, these were no ordinary footprints. The best way I can describe it is a human footprint with claws, like a dog or a wolf. I go to the utility pole and found what it had been holding the night before. It was my niece's tiny little shirt. It goes without saying, we spent the next few days in the safety of my mom's home off the reservation.
This story may be distressing to some viewers. Discretion is advised. This happened when I was at high school. I belonged to a basketball club. I developed a huge crush on a senior at the club. We ended up getting very close. We often met in private together. On a day we both had off from school, he called me, asking me if I wanted to come over and hang out. Of course, I was over the moon to be invited to his home. So I asked him for his address straight away. I'm actually outside your house. Why don't you come out and I'll take you there? I went out there as fast as I could. There was a car waiting outside our family home. There was some weird guy I hadn't seen before sat with my crush in the car. I got in the car and he spun around and said to me, "Let's go have some fun." And with that, we pulled away. I wondered where the hell we were going, or what the hell we were going to do, as the car rumbled through the countryside roads. The car suddenly stopped and my crush blurted out, "I have something I really gotta do. I'll be back as soon as I can." And he left me. Oh my god, why are you leaving now? I thought, but I trusted in him to be right back just as he said. I felt lost and confused, but I just tried to enjoy the drive. After a while the car stopped and we arrived at a house. I knew it wasn't my crush's house, as the nameplate outside was different. The guy in the car then asked, "Why don't we go in and have a drink while we wait?" I felt obliged to accept his offer, as he was friends with my crush. When we got inside, something was wrong. I was getting a very bad vibe. Loads of my new acquaintances' friends were sat around a table. It freaked me out. Why was I brought here? I wondered. The people there were being nice to me there. Before long, night came. I had mentioned a few times my desire to go home before it got too late, yet no one batted an eyelid to this request. I really started to worry now. So I kept stating, I want to go home soon. I had an incoming call from my mum. One of the guys there went crazy at me when I excused myself to answer it. He snatched the phone right out of my hand. This was no longer a friendly or normal situation. The man who took my phone told me I wouldn't be going anywhere. I judged the situation as best I could and came to the conclusion that I had been brought here by my crush to these strange men. Perhaps they were small-time yakuza or something. It seemed as if I would be spending the night here, possibly longer. My heart ached. I just wanted to see my parents again. It's a feeling I wouldn't wish on my worst enemies. Before I knew it, I was bawling my eyes out. They put me in another room and told me to sleep. I tried to think on my feet. I opened the door as quietly as I could. I listened to the men's conversation, and it went like this. "We will get a good price for her from the Koreans." "The poor girl." "It's fine." I couldn't believe I was listening to them discussing my future. After they finished talking, they came upstairs and locked my door. I got in the bed. There wasn't anything else I could do. I resigned myself to my fate. I had to come to terms with the idea that I wouldn't see my parents or friends ever again. I tried to psychologically prepare for whatever would happen next. I saw the early light of morning. I needed the toilet, so I knocked on the door. Someone came to open it. My heart was pounding again. I don't want to do this, but if you try to escape or go somewhere where I can't see you, then... He trailed off. The threat was obvious. I won't try to escape, I whimpered. As I said those words, I apologized from the bottom of my heart to my parents. My life in abduction went on this way for a week, until one night I was forcibly woken from my sleep, dragged out to a car so violently by the man who picked me up originally. I was thrown in, the engine started, and we pulled away. I had no idea where we were headed. To the Koreans, I guess. It had been so hard in these last days and nights to escape reality. I couldn't even comfort myself with family memories, as it would have been just too painful. I was losing my mind. I was ready to die. I couldn't physically cry anymore. I was absent-mindedly gazing out of the passenger side window when I started to notice familiar things from my neighborhood. Then the car pulled to a stop. In front of my house. "Go," said the man. I got out, and he pulled away into the night. He must have felt some sympathy for me, or his conscience kicked in. To this day, I have no idea what caused his change in heart. I was dumbstruck to be returning home safely. I went inside my family home, a place I thought only moments ago I'd never see again. My mother rushed downstairs. She must have heard me come in. She was so angry. Because I was young and stupid, I thought telling her about my abduction would get me into more trouble, or make her worry. So I just told her I'd been staying with a friend. She screamed at me for not getting in touch with her once during the last week. My mother still doesn't know what happened, and it's 10 years later. When I went back to school, I couldn't find a trace of my crush, that senior who had gotten me into that mess. He must have left town before handing me over to those men. I hope he can't sleep at night. I hope he's tormented and tortured by his guilt. It was a truly terrifying event, but I'm very lucky to say that I live well these days, and I live happily.
This all happened at the beginning of last year. I would say sometime in either January or February. A friend and I were working the closing shift at a liquor store that he owned. I was spending the night stocking the shelves, and my friend, and let's call him Bill for privacy reasons, was manning the register, dealing with the handful of customers that we had. This was a pretty normal night. Things were winding down, and there really wasn't much in ways of business that evening. It was around 12:45, and Bill had decided that he wanted to go ahead and lock up early so he could help me finish with the stocking. Then we could get out and get home a bit early. It had been a slow night. Snow always caused the traffic to slow down for the store, and there was no reason for us to stay open another hour if we weren't going to make more than a couple dollars. Missouri state law says that we had to close at 1:30 anyways. We had one last guy come in as Bill was about to lock up. Bill explained that we were about to close in an effort to get this guy to change his mind. He said that he only needed one thing and he knew exactly what it was. And since he was a regular at the store, Bill decided to let him in. I heard the conversation, but honestly ignored the rest of the transaction as I was busy, and I knew that Bill could take care of the guy. Honestly, the customer was a decent dude, so I didn't really mind if it took an extra 5 or 10 minutes. Plus, we were kind of closing up early anyways. So, I'm getting the boxes unloaded as quickly as I can. just trying to finish up, and I hear the door tone go off. We have these two devices that, if something breaks the light beam between them, it makes a beeping noise. This way, we always know if someone comes in or goes out at the store. I stand up thinking that Bill had just let the guy out and locked the door, but to my surprise, there was no one there. I shrugged it off as nothing, thinking that maybe a bug set it off or something, so I go back to putting bottles on the shelves. After a few seconds, I hear a loud glass smashing noise, like someone threw a bottle across the ground. This obviously freaked me out, so I stood up and made a beeline to where the noise came from. When I got there, I see a bottle of rum on the floor halfway across the front area and shattered. I call for Bill to come out the front, and he walks up and sees the bottle, then looks back at me. He shakes his head, tells me I need to be more careful and that I was going to have to pay for it, and then starts to walk away to get the mop. But I stopped him. I told him that I didn't do it. He stares at me for a second, clearly confused. I asked him if the guy that he let in left already, and he tells me that he rang him up and finished that transaction around 10 minutes ago. I stepped toward the front door and pushed it, and sure enough, it was locked. At this point, we were both really confused. There was no way that anyone else was in the store. I was at the other end stocking, and Bill was in the back doing closing stuff, like counting and register. After a few seconds of confused silence, he tells me to come to the back with him. We go into the office. He gets on the computer that's meant for the security cameras, and he pulls the video back a few minutes. In one of the cameras, you could very clearly see that I was there pushing bottles onto the shelves, just doing what I was supposed to do. And on the camera that points near the front door, you could clearly see a bottle edging forward slightly. After a few seconds, this bottle literally flew off the shelf and smashed onto the floor. No one was anywhere near it. We both just sat there, staring at the screen with our jaws wide open. After a couple seconds of us staring with our mouths agape at this old computer monitor, I told him about how the door beeped just before the crash. He turned back to the screen, pulled the footage a few minutes before that, and sure enough, the little blinking red light on the motion detector for our front door lit up. It only does that if someone walks in front of it, but there was nobody there. Honestly, that was the creepiest night that I had ever experienced working there. There are a few more stories, a couple more with bottles falling off shelves, a few more with people hearing voices, but this was honestly the creepiest one that I ever experienced while I worked there.
I saw something creepy as a child. I was in the 4th grade when this happened. I was staying at my friend's house, who had told me a lot about the different ways her house was haunted. They even had a creepy old doll room. I remember the vibe of her house freaked me out in general. But then, one night, my friend decided to randomly hide from me. I looked around for her and couldn't find her, knowing she was just messing with me. So, continuing my search, I stepped into her room where her bathroom door was open just a crack enough to see in slightly. I could see her standing behind the door. I could make out the clothes she was wearing and everything. I started speaking to her, but as I stepped closer, I froze because I realized that wasn't her. The figure seemed almost pixelated in a way, and it was wearing a creepy sort of grin. The eyes were darkened too. I quickly turned and ran out of her room, and as I rounded the corner, my friend jumped out at me from behind her TV. I asked her if she had been in her room just then, and she said no. So I told her what I'd seen, and we went to investigate. The craziest part is that whatever the hell that was still there. She could see it too. We freaked out and ran into a different part of her house, but I don't think I'll ever forget what I saw that night.
This is something that happened to me around 17 years ago, and despite multiple attempts to research what could have happened, I haven't been able to find anything. If any of this sounds familiar to you, please reach out, as this is a mystery that has haunted me and my family since we witnessed it. When I was a teenager, I used to enjoy going on random drives with my mother and her partner. We would get in the car, put on music, and drive around the local area. This was often done at night, as we found it quite calming and relaxing to drive in the dark. On this particular night, we were driving in an area we visited regularly, and we noticed some strange lights in the distance. We realized that the lights were down a small dirt-covered road that we hadn't driven down before. This was a public access road. There were no signs stating that this was private property. There was no gate. It was an open road. We decided to do some investigating and turn down here. As we started down the road, the lights were closer, and we noticed one larger light in the center. We kept going, unsure of what it could have been. As we got closer, we only became more confused, and we turned off our music as to not draw attention to ourselves. In the center of the clearing at the end of the road, there was a large glowing orb. It looked like a huge balloon they had inflated, covered with a cloth, and then tied to the cloth to the ground with ropes to stop it from floating. We noticed that there were some individuals in what looked like inflatable suits, some smaller, glowing orbs covering their heads. They were moving slowly around the larger orb, almost like in some kind of trance. These were the source of the lights we had spotted in the distance, the glowing helmets on these inflatable suits. We rolled down our windows slightly as we tried to figure out what we were seeing. We didn't know if this was some kind of show we weren't aware of, or if this was something we're not supposed to see. We didn't want to get out of the car if we weren't welcome, so we decided to wait a couple of moments to see what was happening. As we rolled down the windows, we noticed a faint chanting coming from the clearing. As we watched, we noticed there were a small number of people around us who weren't in the inflatable suits. One of these people eventually turned to face us. As he noticed us, a couple of the other people present also began to turn and notice we were there. They began to slowly approach our car, and they didn't appear to be welcoming us to the show. The feeling we had was that we were trespassing, and they intended to make us leave. During their approach, we saw another unsuited group closer to the orb, and they were carrying another individual towards it. For what purpose? We didn't want to know. The group of people got closer to us, so we reversed, turned around, and drove out of there as fast as we could. As we left, I turned around in the back seat and could see the orb still floating higher, and the crowd staring up, and the suited figures dancing around it, as well as the group who had approached us were now running, as if they were trying to catch up to us. We managed to get away without having to talk to any of those people, but to this day we do not know what that was. All we know is that we were not welcome, and we are not supposed to have seen it. I can't help but wonder, what happened to the person they carried towards the orb?
The Parking Lot by Cobalt Art. I am a 20 years old female, and the story that I'm going to tell you happened just recently. I had many creepy encounters and experienced a lot of truly scary things during my life, so I figured out this would be the right place to collect all of it. Me and my mother decided to go grocery shopping together 2 days ago, so we took the car and I don't have a license yet, drove to the nearest and biggest mall to get as many supplies as possible because of the ongoing lockdown for the pandemic. It's better to make only a few trips to avoid unnecessary contact with people. It took us a while to arrive there, and once we did, she pulled up near the stores, where I could see a couple of men. It is very common in my area to find some people stationing in malls and supermarkets, parking lots, and they are usually quite harmless if you do as they say. They stay there waiting for cars to come, and when this happens, they show the drivers some parking spots to ask what is called a protection fee. Basically, you pay them or otherwise they will damage your vehicle. It is of course illegal, but the government here doesn't really seem to be bothered by these kind of activities. Anyway, we met those illegal workers many times before, so it wasn't something scary for us. Too scary for us at first. My mother parked the car, and then two of those men came near her window and asked for the fee, which wasn't much luckily. While she was giving them the money, I looked out of the side I was sitting in and then froze. There were at least 10 other men. 2 of them were fighting, I don't know over what, and one of them threw a punch as well. Only when I looked closer, I saw something shiny. In his grip there was a knife. I started freaking out internally because the situation was way more dangerous than it seemed at the beginning. The worst scenarios were running through my head. 2 women, 10 men with a weapon. I was then brought back to reality when my mother told me to get out of the car to reach the stores. So I immediately jumped out of the seat and got by her side ready to protect her. But when I saw she was chatting and exchanging jokes with one of the 2 men from before, I realized she hadn't seen the group of men that were coming towards us. My mother has a very sunny and friendly personality, which, let me tell you, can be a very dangerous thing around strangers. I'm not blaming her. I love my mother so much, but an excessive, expansive attitude can cost you a lot. And I mean a lot. I know sometimes I come off as antisocial, but better be careful and distant than having a knife on your throat. I quickly told her we had to go, with urgency in my voice but keeping a cold and firm tone. If you show people you are scared, then you are screwed. You must never show it, because it makes you an easier target. She followed me, asking what was wrong and trying to tell me that we are safe. So I whispered, "Keep going and stay silent." And only then she saw the group of men staring at us. She proceeded to look in another direction while walking, but I didn't. I gave one of the men a full look of hatred that was screaming, "Do not try to harm us or I will fight." I know they were numerically superior, but I have been practicing boxing for years, so I wasn't going down without battling for my mother's life. The man got the message and looked away. It was still daytime, so if I screamed, people would hear us and call the cops. Plus, criminal prefers, as I said before, easy and weak targets. I haven't brought weapons with me that day. I usually do, but I will make sure to never, ever commit that mistake again. We got out of the mall when it was getting dark. I suggested a secondary way to get to the car since the men were still there in the parking lot. There was little light and we had a lot of things to bring with us now. We made it to the vehicle safely because they didn't see us coming, but I swear I am never going to forget my weapons from now on. Also, I don't know what else would have happened if I hadn't looked out of my window or my mother hadn't listened to me. So, always remember, be aware of your surroundings.
Hey all, before I start, I'd like to give a couple details about me. At the time of this story, I was just finished with my 6th grade year and was very athletic, and took runs every day. This encounter occurred in the summer. And what comes with summer? Heat. So instead of running in the day when it was hotter, I began running in the evening when the sun was down. On the day of the encounter, I followed my normal routine. I told my mom I was going to start my run, and then began to listen to my music on my iPod Shuffle. Now, the way my neighborhood works is that there is only one entrance, which doubles as the only exit as well. I live in a suburban area, so the main road that passes by the entrance to my neighborhood isn't very busy, but it isn't empty either. On the day of the encounter, I was running down the quote-unquote main road of my neighborhood that all the small streets branch off of. I was close to the entrance and could clearly see all the cars passing by. I am also clearly visible to the cars passing by. I remember watching this gray Honda car slam on its brakes at the entrance of my neighborhood. This was done so fast and so hard that I heard the tires squeal over the song I was listening to at full volume. I brushed it off as someone following directions that most likely nearly missed my neighborhood's entrance. The car then began up the road I was running on, going extremely slow, only about 10 miles an hour under the speed limit. I could make out 3 shadows in the car through the darkness and little light from the house's porch lights. 2 at the front of the car and someone in the back seat. As I passed the car, I saw the driver's side window was down. I gave the car a smile and a wave, and I turned down a small street that branched off the road I was running on. Now I remember feeling extremely on edge, so I checked over my shoulder. I saw the car turn around in the middle of the road, and then slowly turn down the street I was running on. Again, I chalked it up to misinterpreting directions, try not to think too much of it, but I really began to freak out. As a girl of my age, I always would jump to the worst possible outcome. I wasn't very tall and only stood at about 5'2", so I knew that I could be easily manhandled if the people in the car had any ill intentions. But I knew that was very unlikely, so I tried to tell myself to calm down. I reached the cul-de-sac at the end of the street, so I was now running on the opposite side of the car. They were still going very slow. What I do next may have saved my life, and I can't imagine what would have happened to me if I didn't. As the car and I were about to be right next to each other, I paused my music but kept my earbuds in, giving the illusion that I was still listening. As the car and I got closer, I heard the 2 men speaking. One of them actually tried to speak to me, yelling, "Hey," or something like that. But I didn't reply because I knew that it would blow my cover and they would know that I was able to hear them. As the car drove a little bit behind me and out of my view, I heard one of them say, "We will get her when we turn back around." I froze. Get me? Felt like something dumped a bucket of freezing water on my head. I knew they had to go around the cul-de-sac still, so I did the only thing I could think of. I sprinted. As I ran down the street, I looked over my shoulder and saw the car had already went around the cul-de-sac and was now going a lot faster after me. I turned into the main road of my neighborhood and ran. I passed my street and just ran as fast as I could towards the end of my neighborhood. My house was the first on the street, so I knew they would see where I lived if I tried to go home. I was scared to death and was running for my life. I had no idea what I could do to get away from these people, so I just pushed my body to go as fast as possible. I continued to check over my shoulder, hoping maybe they wouldn't be there, but they were. They were right behind me, and I distinctly remember they were silent. I had imagined them yelling at each other that I was going to get away, but they were chasing me in silence. To me, that was creepier than if they were to be yelling. When I ran down the last street in my neighborhood, I started running through backyards. That was the only thing I had left to do. I heard the car slam on its brakes, turn off its engine, and 3 doors slam. My heartbeat sped up. I was so convinced they were going to begin chasing after me through the backyards. "Get back in the car. We won't find her like this." My heart dropped as I heard 3 doors shut and the car engine start up again. Now that I was running through backyards, I would have to run across the streets too. This was the scariest part for me because I would be very visible to the people in the car if they were to be driving down the main road. I remember staring at the street, trying to decide whether or not I should try to wait it out or if I should just book it home. I went with book it home. I didn't even check my shoulder as I ran through backyards, jumped over fences, and ran across the streets. I was just waiting for car lights to light up the area around me, or for arms to wrap around me, but it never happened. Somehow the car must have turned down the wrong street or completely missed me, and I truly believe that is the luckiest thing that has ever happened to me. When I got to my house, I wasted no time jumping through the door. Once I slammed my door shut, I sat on the ground and thought about what just happened and what could have happened. I never ended up telling my parents until years later, or calling the police. But if they are still out there, I hope they're locked up somewhere so they can't ever terrorize a child again. I can't imagine what they would have done to me if they ever caught me. Needless to say, let's not meet ever again.
A few years ago, I was renting a house in Northern California. The neighborhood was just outside the suburbs. It seemed like the perfect balance of having space and having nice neighbors close enough to not feel isolated. The area had no streetlights, so it was very dark at night, especially if there were clouds blocking the moonlight. It didn't bother me though. It made my little house feel even more quaint on dark nights. I got home from work one day in midwinter. It was a cloudy night, so pulling up to my house, I saw only what my headlights and front porch light illuminated. When I got out of my car, I caught a whiff of cigarette smoke. That was odd, as I had never smelled that before around that house. I didn't see anyone nearby, so I ignored it and went inside. I had just got off a shift with a few hours of overtime, so I felt pretty tired. Even though it wasn't even 7 yet, I decided to take a shower and call it a night. I woke up sometime later, sure that I'd heard a noise inside my house. I wasn't worried right away because my friend would sometimes stop by to use my shower after work on his way to his night classes. I even gave him a spare key so he could stop by even if I wasn't home. He would always text me to let me know beforehand though, and I hadn't heard my phone go off. I reached over to my bedside table and picked up my cell phone to see if my friend had sent me a text. The bright light from my phone's screen and number pad blinded me. These were the days before phones had a light sensor that would dim the screen in the dark, and this particular phone was so bright I could use it as a flashlight. Through squinted eyes, I could make out that it was 9-something, but I couldn't tell if it had an unread text or not. I set my phone down and called out my friend's name. There were a couple of seconds of silence before I heard loud footfalls as someone started running through the bottom floor of my house. I leapt out of bed and ran to the closet. They were already up the stairs by the time I had opened the door and stepped inside. That house had 3 rooms upstairs, 2 bedrooms on either side of the hallway, the one I was in, and a spare, and a bathroom at the end. The bedroom doors were both closed, but the bathroom door was cracked open. I heard whoever was in my house thunder down the hallway past my door and into the bathroom. Thank God he did. That gave me enough time to open the attic access in the ceiling of my closet and hoist myself up. I had just started to lift myself up when the person ran back out of the bathroom. My feet were barely inside of the attic when my bedroom door burst open. I heard footsteps run into my room and stop. When they didn't see me in that room, they ran back to the hallway and into the other room, which just had boxes stacked in a corner, some weights, and a table where I painted my miniature models. I guess they decided that if someone were hiding, it would be in the bedroom, because they charged back into my room and turned on the light. A moment later, the closet door was ripped open. I was crouched in my attic just a foot or so away from the access, so I could try to stop them if they started to climb up. From my vantage point, all I could see was from about their knee down. They were wearing dirty blue jeans with frayed cuffs and worn work boots. After a few seconds of looking in the closet, they stepped away and I heard a loud crash come from my room, followed by a scream of frustration and anger. That scream was the most unnerving part of the incident for me. It reminded me far too much of my stepfather, who would scream in a similar way when he lost his temper. He would eventually be put in a mental hospital for several mental disorders that resulted in erratic and violent tendencies. The man in my house ran back down the stairs. I heard crashes and clatters as things were thrown around and furniture was knocked over. I stayed crouched in the attic. I had left my cell phone when I ran for the closet, and I wasn't certain I could climb down without him hearing. After some time, the noises stopped. I started counting slowly. When I reached 1,000, I decided it was safe enough to climb down and call the police. The first thing I noticed when I exited the closet was the intruder had flipped my bed over. I assume in an attempt to find me. That was a loud noise I had heard when he stepped away from the closet. I couldn't find my cell phone, so I went to the landline by the bed and called the police. I waited in my room until I heard them call out from downstairs. The first floor was a mess, but I had expected that. Chairs had been knocked over, the sofa had been flipped, all the books, pictures, and knickknacks I had on my shelves were strewn across the floor. The cupboards in the kitchen had been opened, and all the boxed and canned foods had been thrown to the ground. As far as I could tell, though, the only thing missing was a single knife out of the wooden block in my kitchen. The police checked the house from top to bottom. They found that the side door had been forced open by something like a crowbar. They also found a few cigarette butts along my fence line, along with some foil and an empty pen tube, which the police said people often used to smoke meth. So they think he had been watching my house for a while. I realized that he must have been out there smoking a cigarette when I got home. They collected up the evidence and told me I should stay with family or friends that night and get that door fixed as soon as possible. I opted to just not sleep. I moved a shelf over to block the broken door and spent the next couple hours cleaning things up. I would often go to the window with a flashlight and shine it along the fence line where the police found the cigarette butts and foil, but I didn't see anything. The next day I called to have the door fixed and motion lights installed at the back and sides of my house. I ran a phone cable up into the attic and added a landline. I never wanted to be stuck up there without a phone again. Nothing else happened at that house, though. I lived there another 3 years without incident. One more precaution I took was practicing getting out of my bed, going to my closet, and climbing into the attic as quickly and quietly as possible. I even kept at it when I moved, except now I go into a crawl space at the back of the closet instead of the attic. I try not to think about what would have happened if I had been a bit slower getting to the attic, or if he hadn't gone into the bathroom at the end of the hall first.
"5 years ago, I was being prescribed anti-anxiety medication for sleep. I'd been using it for 4 years or so at this juncture. When I'd take them, I'd pass right out and sleep all night, but sometimes I wouldn't. Sometimes I'd try to fall asleep naturally. Big mistake. People oftentimes don't understand how powerfully these drugs affect the brain. In particular, the drugs I was on affected my GABA receptors, which are the electrical signals your brain sends through a small gulf in the nervous system, which cause you to relax. These medications would provide a rush of artificial GABA, which eventually your brain accepts as real, shutting down your natural production. And from this, if you abruptly stop these drugs, you go into a potentially lethal grand mal seizure. That previous pop analysis I've given you is just an introduction to make you understand how severely your brain is affected by anti-anxiety medication, and how they basically scramble the wiring in the brain. Which leads me to segue into something else which is very often utterly terrifying. Hallucinations. The phenomenon of sleep paralysis is widely known thanks to the internet. This is the foundation of my own nocturnal hallucinations. This always occurred if I would doze off without taking the medication. A purely natural slumber. I'd fall asleep briefly, sometimes for up to an hour. However, I couldn't simply wake up. No. Instead, I'd be slowly pulled out of a nightmare. Always a nightmare. For me, there was one which would recur, being chased by wolves. The plotline never altered. I'd be running through a dark forest, and I could hear them, snarling, nipping at my sprinting heels with razor teeth. The wolves were enormous, dark brown and rabid, bloodshot eyes, and slobber flapping off of their knife-like canines. As the intensity and fear would mount, my eyes would slowly open. Sometimes I'd make it to a fence, and, in the nick of time, climb just high enough that they couldn't reach me. Other times, not so much. I could see my room in the middle of the night, and my eyes always seemed pointed in the direction of my half-open bedroom door. At some point, it would lazily creak open, and several black, four-legged hellhounds would enter, circling the bed as I struggled to breathe, and, in a fit of terrified desperation, try shaking myself awake. They'd close in, trying to jump into the bed, jaws making clapping noises as they tried to clamp my flesh. I'd wiggle my toes, then my foot, then my ankles, and then legs and fingers, and slowly, over a period of minutes, I might get myself out of it. Or I'd be paralyzed all over again and have to start over. Several times my wife would wake up to her husband gasping for air, and she'd shake me out of it. It would take me a minute or several to fully realize I was no longer being hunted by rapacious predators. This went on constantly, but one night, something different occurred. I began to wake from a dream I can't recall. I couldn't say it was necessarily bad, but I remember vividly struggling to catch my breath, as usual. My eyes opened, fixated on the bedroom door, open slightly, leading out into a pitch-dark hallway. The door slowly opened, just a nudge. I would later find out that, in fact, it did open, but not by me, and not by my wife. As it quietly unfurled, I noticed a figure in the doorway. I'd seen figures before, dark shadow figures, like the wolves, or, sometimes, a hooded entity, which would come in, sit on the edge of the bed and stare at me until I could shake myself out of it. There are legends all around the world which proclaim these figures are real, which I'd normally contest as hallucinatory, but this night was different. The figure, the tall, thin figure in the doorway, was all white. For minutes, which could have been 3 or could have been 15, my heart raced, as the tall, pale figure stood unmoving, leering at me from that dreaded hallway, staring at me and my wife. I got a deep-seated feeling that the sanctity of our home was being invaded. This thing, whatever it was, it didn't belong here. After some time, it stepped forward, into the room. The door was now wide open, and still it just stood, fixed on me. I observed the figure in grave detail, as I simultaneously hyperventilated, suffocating. It was an old, wrinkly woman, very tall, with a torn, ripped old dress over her shoulders. And she was floating. Slowly and gradually, she floated closer to the bed, to the bottom corner where my wife sleeps, and continued to stare. Brows furrowed in anger, wrinkled mouth formed into a hateful scowl. And then, she languidly floated around the bed, across the bottom, and turned the corner to my bedside, and once again stood still. Her scowl slowly unturned, not into a grin, but an expression undescribable, before she moved closer, all the way to my pillow, hovering over me, her hate-filled, dilated eyes burning into my soul. This was the one time I ever remember being in this half-conscious state, saying to myself in my head, "It's only a dream, it's only a dream." Finally, she leaned in, directly over my head, her thin, weary gray hair dancing around my head, tickling my face. I felt it. I never so feverishly tried to escape a hallucination before or after in my life. Finally, her face inches from mine, her pungent roadkill breath penetrating my nostrils. She opened her mouth and drool began to spill all over me, groaning something I can only describe best as blah. I began forcefully pounding and thrashing like I was drowning in the middle of the ocean, and then finally I woke up, with my pillow over my face, soaked in drool, saliva running down my cheeks. I threw it halfway across the room and sprang upright, cocking my head back and forth, looking around the room while I dried my face with the sheets. What's even worse? My wife woke up just seconds later. I didn't even see her wake up. I only heard her voice. "Babe?" she asked. I looked at her, and then she asked me something I won't ever forget. Not even the tenor in her voice. Is someone here?" The next day, she didn't remember it. If you know anything about sleep paralysis, then you've likely heard of old hag syndrome. Yes, shadow figures are a known phenomenon. However, the visually detailed manifestation of the old hag has been widely reported around the world, and it's always the same. A tall, frail, disgusting old woman with long, wild hair, terrorizing people in the middle of the night, and it's been recorded for centuries. When I articulated the feeling of home invasion, I can say that I've only felt this way when I got my one and only visit from the hag. I pass off all the others as simple and unfortunate effects of powerful prescription medication. This, however, truly felt like a visit. I hope it's the last one.
Trust your gut, your dog, or your cat. This happened 15 years ago, when I had just come home from college on winter break. Home this time was not the house I grew up in. My parents had just moved closer to a small city, so it just didn't feel the same to be in a different space. Maybe that's what triggered my worry. In my family, I'm always the one thinking of worst case scenarios, generally distrustful and mostly seeming like the annoying worrywart. Call it what you will, but it's also the gift of fear, am I right? One cold night, my parents had gone to bed upstairs, and the dog had followed suit. I thought I'd watch TV in the living room for a bit before going to sleep and settling in on the couch. The living room was in the front of the house, and with the recent move, the shutters on the windows weren't there at the time, only see-through curtains that weren't really drawn. I noted this, but was used to our rural setting when the only ones who could see in were the neighbors we knew so well. I'm watching TV for about a half an hour when the screen cuts out. It just goes snowy. This was back in the days when you watched whatever your local cable channels brought you. I looked up from whatever I was doing, texting, maybe with a flip phone, at first thinking, well, that sucks. But something felt off. I tried the remote, but no other channels worked, and so was sitting there, thinking what I should do instead, when my cat jumps up onto the windowsill and starts wailing. What the fuck? This may seem innocuous, but anyone who knew my cat knew this was not part for the course. He was pacing and waiting at the window. A feeling of dread washed through me, and I was frozen. That feeling of dread is so fiercely visceral. What the hell is going on? What is out there? I tried to settle myself down in this unfamiliar dark house and felt a little better. Because what are the chances? But then there it was. I swear on all I have that this cold waft of air blew through and that I heard the side door. I didn't realize that door was there at the time. I heard a door on the side of the house and felt cold air. I became unfrozen. I bolted. I ran upstairs to wake my parents and slumbering dog and frantically tell them someone is trying to get in the house. They, I think, were annoyed. I'm a warrior, remember? Still, they get up and I think to try to placate me by looking around the house. They go check all the rooms including the basement, while I'm scared and exasperated. They're sleepily roaming about into the dark rooms, unarmed, when God knows who has probably made it inside already. Well, they didn't find anything. They verbally patted me on the head and said goodnight, and I felt foolish. That is, until the next morning. I don't know what prompted my parents to call the police, but they showed up and asked me how I knew someone was out there. Well, hold up, what? I started answering. Well, the cat was meowing a lot on that windowsill, and my voice trailed off, waiting for the reaction I usually get, which I got. The cop smirks. A cat, huh? Cub, bruh. Get on with it. He goes on to say that someone cut the cable wires on the side of the house. That either someone thought they were disarming some alarm, or they saw me sitting watching TV and wanted to mess with me. And the side door? Muddy Grounds gave us the ability to see the fresh tracks right up to it. It didn't look like it had been fooled with, but I know what I heard. Whatever it was. I knew it! I said to my parents. The triumphant feeling was short-lived. When I start to mull what I was so sure about had been true. True, I did know someone was out there. I also knew I would always check that side door and take some cues from the cat just to be safe.
I moved a lot when I was growing up. By the time freshman year of high school came around, I had moved 7 or so times, and I was about a year and a half into my most recent move. I had found a pretty close group of friends in middle school, and we all went to high school together. I met him through one of those close friends. They were in a band together, and even though he was almost 4 years older than us, we welcomed him into our group. Sam was easily twice my size, tall and heavy-set, and originally kind of intimidating, although I was never afraid of large men before him. Lesson learned. I had kind of a bad home life, and I spent as much time as I could at school, sometimes hanging around the school campus until 6 or 7 at night with this group of friends. 3 of us lived in the same direction, and we would walk home together. One slightly colder evening, Sam offered to walk me home since the others had gone home already. I just thought that he was being a gentleman. He then mentioned something from when he lived in California. He didn't walk a friend home one night, and something horrible happened. He left it at that, and I let him walk me home. We got a lot closer after that, and we bonded over both living in California, and we exchanged numbers. He would message me late into the night about his depression and self-harm, and I just wanted to help. A few months later, he tried asking me out. It was this big romantic gesture. He learned a Disney song on the ukulele and sang it to me in the cafeteria, but I was already dating someone, so when I turned him down, he became angry. I started seeing him everywhere. We were still friends, and we still hung out in the same group, but I would often pass him on the street walking somewhere, and a few minutes later I would see him change directions, and he then would follow me. He would walk me to my classes by following me in the passing period at a distance. I started minimizing the group time that I spent together with him, and he would just follow me more. I had friends meet me at each class and walk me to my next one because I felt unsafe and he knew where I lived. He then started talking, not to me, but to my mutual friends about the one girl in California who we tried walking home. At first, she just shared my name and some other coincidences. She then started having the same brown curly hair and blue eyes, and every time that he told the story about her, she became more and more like me. He then said what happened. Over several weeks, the fantasy evolved. They were walking home one night and were jumped by someone with a knife. It was a robbery gone wrong on her birthday, January 24th, which is also my birthday. She then died horribly, and he couldn't react in time. She then bled out in his arms. Sarah, who has brown curly hair, blue eyes, my name, my birthday, and sounds just like me, bled out in his arms. Each retelling adding more and more detail. And this guy with his sick fantasy about my ending would follow me around and knew where I lived. My boyfriend was abusive mentally and physically, but I stayed as close to him as I could because if anything were to happen, I knew that he would throw a punch. I never felt safe at school or in our little town walking home from school at night. One day at school, Sam had a breakdown. He freaked out and ran out of the school in a panic. I was sent after him, and I found him curled up on the floor. I got closer to him. I knew about his anxiety and depression, and my safety set aside. I wanted to make sure that he was okay. It was then that he told me this horrifying story that I was hearing from my mutual friends with even more detail. We had been walking home from a concert in California. We had passed a dark alley and a homeless man came out with a rusty knife and asked for anything valuable. I fumbled for my phone. I didn't have anything else on me, and the homeless man thought that I was calling the police. He stabbed me once, twice, again and again, and Sam just stood there horrified. He saw red, grabbed a broken glass bottle near my body, and attacked the homeless man. He said that he ended him with his own knife, and he also told me that he ended somebody else. My real-life stalker told me that he ended somebody. It didn't matter how messed up he was anymore. I didn't care if it was fantasy or real, and I didn't care if it would affect his mental health. I needed to go to the police. I was starting to become scared for my own life. My friends convinced me to go to the school counselor first. That morning, we went and told them everything. The stalking, the stories, and how he admitted to ending someone, and that was the real reason they left California. I was afraid for my life and I wanted to call the police. The counselor didn't take us seriously. She went to the principal, and the principal, who was not a mental health expert, called Sam in and talked about the accusations. The principal then informed me that he did not think that Sam had any kind of mental illness or that I was in any real danger. I lost faith in adults that day. I gave up on going to the police. I stayed with my friends and they walked me between classes. I was also hiding behind my abusive boyfriend, and I would often look behind me if I was walking home that year. The counselors ended up gaslighting us to the point where we started feeling that this was a fever dream, and I would start to think that it was made up if it weren't for my journal entries recording the events and my growing panic and all of the stories from my friends. Hey Sam, let's not meet again. Edit. I don't think anyone actually was ended in California. I think that he's a pathological liar and that he was so deep in fantasy that he convinced himself that this was real. No, I wasn't physically hurt, but the emotional scarring and threats that he posed me was 100% real.
Hi y'all. I've been a lurker on Reddit in general for a while, and this is my first post, so forgive me if it's a bit choppy. I live in good old northeastern Maryland, closer to Delaware, and during the time of this story, I lived in a fairly new development. My family was the first family that lived in the house. In fact, we own the house since it was built. That is still surrounded by forest and farmland. I also explored the area by myself, sometimes traveling miles to different areas of woods. The forests weren't too thick, but they were thick enough where you could be fully encased in them without seeing the edges for a while. I've got lots of fun stories, but let's get into this one. This event happened years ago, and I made peace with the event as perhaps being some sort of time anomaly where it was somehow proof the past, present, and future are all stacked on top of each other. I forget the terminology, but that's not really important to the story. I was home with only my mother in the house with me. We've had several strange paranormal experiences between the two of us in and outside of the house and around the development, but nothing like this. We were both upstairs, and the layout of the upstairs floor plan had my parents' room on one side of the house, and mine was on the opposite side. Between us was a large foyer that had the steps to downstairs with a tall ceiling connecting the first and second floor and a large bay window. It was midday on a weekend. I was high school age and playing on my phone in my bedroom while my mom was in her bedroom taking a shower in her adjoining bathroom. It was quiet. Quiet enough that I remember noting how eerie it was. Out of the dead silence, I heard my voice, clearly calling out, "Mom!" in some sort of irritated tone coming directly from the bottom of the steps in the foyer. I remember thinking I was hearing things, But when my mom responded, "What?" in that, "I'm in the shower, why can't you kids leave me alone for 2 seconds of peace" tone, I shot up and sped walked out of my room, hesitating to cross past the foyer, afraid of what I might see standing at the base of the steps. I said screw it and ran across, glancing down the stairs. Nothing. There was nothing. I ran into the bathroom with my mom, and all I could say was, "That wasn't me." "What?" she replied. "That wasn't me." She believed me, having experienced several strange things in the house as well. Most notably, the woman that would walk into my sister's room every once in a while. She would usually only show up in your peripheral vision, but once I saw her head on. But that's another story. Anyway, we still talk about it today, and theorize what it could have been. I feel the land is haunted in general in that area. I still have so many questions. Could this have been a cryptid? Specifically a mimic, but is it even possible that they mimic the voice of a person within the area? It's been a good 4 or 5 years since this happened, and I still can't put my finger on it. Any thoughts? Thank you for reading. Update. Thank you all so much for sharing your experiences. I love reading them all, so if you're feeling hesitant, please feel free to share.
This is The Shadow in the Woods by P.A. Nightmares. Hi, I don't recant this tale very often because it's still terrifying to think about. I had just recently graduated high school and was around 18 to 19 years of age. My older sister and I decided we wanted to do something special that Halloween. So, for the first time in our lives, we decided to do one of the ghost tours on the Gettysburg battlefield. We had lived near Gettysburg all of our lives. Our disinterest towards the battlefield stemmed from having too many field trips while we were in high school. However, we decided to give a ghost tour a chance. Up until this point, I didn't really believe in the supernatural. I thought it was a load of crap. However, that all changed on this one tour. The tour started off with us going into a basement of a bed and breakfast. The bed and breakfast was interesting. The basement had a table that I clocked full of children's toys. Me and my sister both thought this was odd, but we didn't question it. Instead, we just took our seats and waited for our tour guides to start telling their tale. According to the guides, this basement was home to a harmless spirit of a little boy that had died during the Gettysburg battle. As they continued to tell their story, my sister screamed and yelled that something was playing with her hair. Our guides just laughed at each other and told her not to worry, that the little boy was drawn to her. They said he was drawn to teachers and new mothers, which she was both. So this made sense that he was drawn to her. After they finished, they stopped us before we could leave and asked my sister to turn out her pockets. We thought this was odd, but when she turned out her pockets, there was a little race car inside of them. The tour guides just laughed and said that he was trying to give her a gift. We gave the toy car back and proceeded on to the next area of our tour. This one was outside on the actual battlefield itself. As our tour guide continued to tell us the tale of the battle that raged in that particular area of the battlefield, I noticed a sign that says "Do Not Enter." When our tour guide paused and asked if we had any questions, I asked why that area was off limits. The tour guide told me that that was a home to a particularly nasty Confederate soldier that had claimed that area as his domain. I asked if we were able to go into the area. Where the tour guide was reluctant to allow me access, she said that it was not actually off limits. As I progressed into the area, I noticeably felt a shift in the energy. It was like my entire body went into fight or flight mode and it just wanted to flee from this area. I did not pay it any heed and continued regardless. As I got further into the wooded area, I heard a tour guide yell back, "Don't cross the fallen tree." I thought to myself, yeah right, ghosts don't exist, I'll do what I want. Getting to the fallen tree, I put my foot on it and was unable to move, was unable to advance any further. In front of me, not more than 15 feet, I heard the neigh of a horse and what I now know to be the packing of a rifle used during the Civil War. Along with that, I heard a click followed by a loud boom and a flash from the muzzle. Feeling the projectile whiz by my face but not being able to see anything, I turn around and nope the fuck out of there really quick. Since these events have taken place, I have had several encounters with a shadow person. I am not sure if these events are connected or not, but until this encounter with the shadow in the woods, I had never had a supernatural encounter. Since then, I've had several.
He stalked me to my home. Written by Anonymous and narrated by Lady Spookaria. I was 17 when this happened. I had spent the night at a friend's place and it was still quite warm outside, still summer, so I decided to walk home from the little get-together. There were about 10 of us, each of us carrying on and watching movies. Nothing exciting. I gave everyone a hug and kiss goodnight. I had a can of drink and began to walk home. My house wasn't far. It was just a couple of blocks and the night air was pretty pleasant. The area was known for being pretty safe too. I had forgotten how many times I had walked back home without any issues at all. I said my goodbyes and set off. It was quiet and I was enjoying being out in the fresh night air. A man walked past me. Now, most men are pretty considerate and will try to show that they aren't dangerous. I expected to hear his footsteps. I tried to discreetly look over my shoulder at him. He just stood there, watching me. I felt a shiver go down my spine. I didn't recognize him from anywhere. Immediately I wanted to run home, but I did my best to hide my fears. I doubled my speed, trying and failing to look unbothered by the situation. He changed directions and began to follow me. I fiddled around in my pocket for my phone. The short journey seemed so long and I called one of my friends. "Hey, how are you?" I greeted her brightly, still trying to make it sound like it was a normal conversation. I didn't think at the time that I should call the police or something. I thought if they heard I was talking to someone, he might think twice about actually starting something. "Hey, did you leave something here?" "No, I just wanted to talk." Thing is, I hate talking on the phone. I never call and everyone has to call me first. Even when I do call someone, I give the shortest, most abrupt answers. So, she was pretty suspicious. "Are you sure you're okay?" He didn't seem to care. I kept walking and he wouldn't stop following me. The pace of his footsteps increased. I walked faster and I knew I shouldn't have gone home, but I wanted to be where I felt safest. I knocked frantically on the door, hoping for one of my parents to open it. He didn't run towards me. He just waited on the path and watched. I could barely see his face. Then I heard footsteps again behind me and my knocking became more intense. When the door finally opened, I practically leapt inside and my dad gave me a confused look. I pointed outside and said that some creep was following me. My dad is a big guy, he's scary but a total teddy bear, but he can be scary though. He opened the door and the guy ran off. Every so often though, especially when I'm home alone, I swear I get a glimpse at him, staring through one of my windows.
So the story takes place a few years ago. I grew up in a trailer park in an extremely low-income part of California's Central Valley. The park itself was originally established as a retirement community for seniors, and my grandmother had bought a nice double-wide upon her retirement. But as the years went by, the age and retirement requirement was dropped, and the park filled in with all sorts of unsavory types. My mom and I moved in with my grandmother after she was diagnosed with cancer in 2001. And after she died, which was on September 11th of 2001, we decided to stay in the trailer and try to fix it up, and then sell it. Life got in the way. Plans fell by the wayside, and 9 years later, we were still living there. Our neighbors were interesting. The trailer to the right of ours shuffled through a bunch of different renters in the 10 years that we lived there, including a guy who was arrested for throwing his girlfriend through one of the windows, and another couple of dudes who never lived there, but just used it to grow marijuana. But the people to our left were really nice. They were a pretty typical trailer park couple, Cindy and Nerl. She was this tiny lady with tattooed eyeliner and a Betty Boop tramp stamp who collected Precious Moments figures, and would often walk around with her fake teeth out. And he was a Vietnam vet, Berkeley grad, and former engineer who, in his retirement, had decided to just settle down, drink beer, and work on his motorcycles. Nerl was a really good guy who was pretty protective of my mom and myself, so we didn't feel like we were in much danger for most of the time that we lived there. In the fall of 2009, however, things started to get weird. Nerl joined an outlaw motorcycle gang that had roots in drug trafficking. According to Cindy, he just wanted to ride with them, but he started getting sucked into the subculture, and it was scary. The park that we lived in was full fenced in and gated. I used to go out running in the early morning or evening before it got too hot. One loop around the full park was a mile, and I'd do that 3 or 4 times. You had to carry a big stick or pepper spray in case someone's dog got loose, but somehow you got used to these kind of things. I'd been doing this since I was 14, and had never run into anything weird or scary aside from the aforementioned dogs. But around the time of his induction into the club, I started seeing strange people on bikes stationed in various parts of the park, not doing anything, just sitting there. So one evening in late May, I'm out on my regular run, headphones on, pepper spray, which I wasn't licensed to use, but I never had to use it on anything but a pit bull. Totally in the zone. Near the end of the 4th loop, I turn the corner to head down my street, and I see 3 guys on bikes just sitting in the middle of the street, just staring. I know what Nerl's bike looks like, and none of those were his. So I have just kept going down the street. The smart thing to do is take the damn detour, because these guys look pretty sketchy to me. But I'm tired, having run 4 miles in 90-degree heat, and taking the detour would mean going past a house belonging to this old guy who liked to hoot and holler at me whenever I would go past. Being a moron, I kept jogging along the street, obviously heading towards the fucking Black Hat Brigade like absolutely nothing here is out of the ordinary. What those 3 scary guys on bikes parked in the middle of the street are doing, I have no clue. It seems to happen here every day, so I just play it cool. When I get close, one of them revs their bike. You know, the vroom vroom noise. I know nothing about the current terminology. Another shouts, "Hey!" I have my headphones in and pretend that I can't hear them, so I give a little wave and just keep going. Big mistake, because as soon as the dude sees that I'm not going to stop for him, he peels out and turns around, starts to cruise after me down the street. Now I'm terrified. I'm maybe 40 feet from my house, and the adrenaline is kicking in. I drop the pepper spray, which is an idiot move, and start running faster than I have ever run before. It's like a Roadrunner cartoon in real life. My headphones come out of my ears and are dragging on the ground when I don't even notice, because the dude is gaining on me. Well, duh, he's on a motorcycle, of course. I fly down the street, into my yard, up the stairs, and into my house, locking and bolting the door behind me, and go running into my mom's room to tell her what's going on. She tells me to get down on the floor and not look out my windows. Just as she does, we hear this guy banging on our back door. Not saying anything, just banging. For at least 20 minutes. Our back door was kind of flimsy, and if you pulled on it the right way, you could tug it open even when it was locked. So we just sat in the bathroom in the very back of the trailer, praying that he wouldn't start pulling. My mom calls the cops. The cops take their sweet time to show up, as per usual in our neighborhood, and by the time they arrive, the bikers are long gone. We gave a statement, but that was pretty much the end of it, until 2 days later, when Cindy comes over, sobbing about how she just got a call that Nerl was stabbed in a fight with a rival biker gang at a tattoo parlor a few blocks away. There is a news article about it. I don't know exactly what these guys were doing in our neighborhood that day. Reckon, maybe, or what they thought flagging down his teenage neighbor would accomplish. but those cracks and indentations from the dude's giant fist in our back door scared the shit out of me every time that I saw them. So for a few weeks after that, we had to deal with seeing random guys on bikes stationed around the neighborhood. Cindy said they were Knurl's guys and taking care of things. I didn't go out running alone again for as long as I lived there. Oh, and the cherry on top of this whole shit Twinkie pie, about a year later, we found out that a trailer just up the street from ours was being used as a meth lab. That was when we finally noped the fuck out and moved to the East Coast. See ya never ever again, trailer park.
I am Magpie Stories, and I present Words from a Friend. This story was told to me by someone who, with the passing of time, has faded from friend to acquaintance to a person I only think about occasionally. I am not proud of this, but can anyone maintain every friendship of their youth? What is remarkable is not the friendship, but the story that they told. It was revealed to me while we were still in the fuzzy embrace of slight drunkenness, that strange time of introspective quiet, as you know a night of festivities are ending, and you are willingly resigned to return home, to a bed, or at least somewhere to sleep. You will not believe this. His eyes slightly manic. This I attributed to his occasional vice of taking things that had more of a kick than alcohol. For once I stayed silent. It was the hint of liquid silver pain in the corners of the eyes, the absent-minded scratching of his forearm, the skin turning red with repetition. I know you don't believe in the afterlife. Strange, I thought. We had discussed this before and mocked those with faith over a drink in a pub on more than one occasion. We were at university after all, young men of learning. We knew best. So he told me the tale. I call it a tale as if it could be considered remotely true, and then it is something I wish not to be even vaguely aware of. I shall retell it, and endeavour to cover all the salient points. I will not try to influence you. I will simply leave it to you to decide upon the story's veracity. Though I can't recount this tale to you the way he did, I will attempt to do it justice in my own fashion, in order to maintain privacy. The names of people and places have been omitted or changed. This is his story. It was while I was at school. It was one of England's minor public schools. I was only a day boarder, going home in the evenings, and I often snuck back into the dorms at dark. I was always popular. My father was a drunk and kept bottles all over the house. He never noticed if one or two went missing. So, at the weekends especially, I would meet with my friends. We were in the 5th form when I first noticed him, a small boy, sickly looking. It was like when you noticed a high-pitched noise when in a room. When you notice it, you cannot shake it. So it was with this strange little boy. I would glance over at him now and again. He was there peeking at my friends and I. He would mostly appear when we were sitting and drinking and smoking secretly in rooms late at night. I tried to pay him no mind. It was a glorious time. We behaved, as all teenagers do, with a sense of superiority, ours bolstered, as we went to a fee-paying school and our parents were well off and middle class. Our paths through life were to be ones of success. We would get into good universities and go into jobs that paid well. So we celebrated, too often, perhaps, drank, and were irresponsible. We whiled away the time messing about. Still, I had my shadow. Still, he was there, watching with his dark eyes, silent. Those eyes would suck the joy out of me. I resolved to speak to him. I joked with the other boys about girls and who could drink the most, who would captain the rugby team in the autumn term, and I saw him peering round a corner. Right, I'm going to have it out with that little shit. I ran off round a corner, not hearing a murmur of confusion in my wake. As I reached the corner, nothing. just a darkened corridor. Upon returning to my companions, they questioned me about the event. They all laughed at me, mocking me. Questions of what boy? They all claimed not to have seen him, all except one who remained oddly quiet. The evening continued, and I knew it was time to leave. I headed out of a window with a trellis that led to the ground below, a trick I'd used 100 times before. I'd made my goodbyes and the bottles were empty. As I began my descent, my arms were grasped by feverish hands. You've seen him too, you swear? Half in and out of the window as I was, I panicked and fell the 8 feet to the ground, straight onto my back, breath punched out of me. I stared at the figure surrounded with a halo of weak light. I do not clearly remember the next few minutes, but I seem to remember seeing a smaller face with dark eyes peering from behind the boy who had so feverishly asked the question. I lay there, the dew from the grass finding its way through the cloth of my trousers and jumper. As I lay there, my friend descended and apologised. He explained he had seen the boy time and time and time again, never outside of the school gates, but only in the older part of the building, of which his dorm room was part. He seemed genuinely scared when he asked about the others, if they had seen him. He had been given the same response I had. He'd even asked one of the masters about it. One in particular had stiffened and told him to stop being peculiar, and shuffled away without saying another word. There was a mania to his story, a panic, a fear. Look, what's the matter with you? It's probably nothing. Tonight, you saw him. He was not in the old building. Look, you're not having me on. I assured him no. In his mannerisms and attitude, it was as if he saw this manifestation as a harbinger of doom. He listed a string of unconnected misfortunes, all occurring when he had seen the boy, and the feeling of joy seeping, oozing from him with every visitation. I began to scoff at him. Don't laugh at me, you just fell out the bloody window. With that he left, and returned to the dormitory through the window. I turned with a disparaging remark and walked home, booze still swimming around my head. My father had passed out in the armchair in the sitting room, the television still on, but quietly. I went to bed, dreaming of dark things, and of strange coincidences, of being trapped in old buildings. I went to bed with the expectation of seeing all my friends at school on Monday. Sunday passed uneventfully, my father and I ignoring each other and nursing our separate hangovers. I returned to school on Monday morning and saw all the boys, all except one who had asked so feverishly about a boy with dark eyes. It was not like in films. He had left no note. That was the end of his story. Oh, come on, I said, hoping to shatter the feeling of creeping dread. Yes, well, I never saw that boy again. Not until recently. It was then I remembered him telling me about the death of one of his school friends, one who had been cleaning roofs as part of a summer job. He had slipped, falling onto iron railings. We never spoke of this event again. As I said, that friendship went the way of so many. I still think about him, now and again.
When I was 19, I was a Marine and had stupidly used my military perks to get a home loan and bought my first house. I moved a barracks room worth of stuff into this place that seemed like a palace to me. Of course, I went out and bought some bar stools and a futon to sleep on until I got a bed, and used some coffee tables as my TV stand. I also had my dog with me. I was unpacking my meager belongings in the living room and noticed a car pulled into my driveway and blocked me in. I walked out and stood there for a moment, and there stood a man offering to sell me a home security system. The man was dressed in khakis and a polo with a name tag that I can't recall. And the car didn't have a logo on it. I should have seen this as a red flag, but I figured that some people on the job didn't drive company vehicles. He gave me his card. I don't remember the company that he told me he was with, to be honest. Cue the friendly salesman, giving me his pitch about needing a system and all the perks that would come with being able to watch the exterior of my house at any time. As a low-ranking military member, I knew I couldn't afford anything yet, but my mind was working on trying to get this man to go away. I even considered ninja chopping him or whatever. It's what we Marines do in hand-to-hand combat. Just to get him to leave. But I'm sort of a passive person. I'm too... nice? Nah, let's call it polite. I won't be rude to someone doing their job. I have been in customer service, so I can relate. I tried politely declining his offer after he tried to show me some stuff on his iPad, but you know how persistent these types can be. I'll admit that my own stupidity when answering his questions, like giving out too much information. Do you live alone? No, I live with my wife and our 3 large dogs. At least I added the large part. Her and her dogs hadn't actually moved in yet, and hers were just fat. Though, they were more vicious than my own good boy. But 2 women living together probably seemed like easier targets. I also mentioned being a Marine when he asked. He had seemed a bit shocked, but wouldn't be deterred. What kind of security system do you have? My dogs and me. Not the best answer I could have given, but I wasn't exactly intimidating. I mean, I would be more terrifying if I had a gun or something. I've been using them all my life, and I've never missed a target, alive or inanimate. If you would invite me in, I could show you the place best for setting up cameras. He mentioned more than a few times. Each time made me more and more creeped out, thinking he was wanting to potentially rob me. Not that there was much to take. Despite being a sexual assault victim, all I could consider was possible burglary, and made sure that we stayed away from my house as we talked. We were outside for 15 minutes total, me spending most of my time trying to politely get him away from here and retreat back inside. I wound up at my wit's end with social niceties and just walked away, leaving him standing there alone in my front yard. I walked into my house and locked the door. He got into his car and left, and I thought nothing of it. After some unpacking, I couldn't do much. I had nowhere to put most of it. I ate some junk food and put together a futon. I got it all decked out with my fluffiest blankets, made sure the doors and windows were locked, and went to lay down in the living room. Looking back, I'm not sure why I didn't put it in my bedroom. They all have blinds, and the rooms take a bit of getting to. Perhaps I wanted to be near an exit. For some context, my back door is double glass paned. At the time, I didn't have curtains on it. But I did have blinds on the kitchen window. My kitchen, living room, and dining room are all connected. But there's a wall in the living room that I strategically situated my futon against so it couldn't be seen by back doors, or the front windows. Call me paranoid. I'd been laying down for a few hours, and about 11, my dog got off the futon and went to the back doors. My dog is large and looks like a Rottweiler in coloring. He's actually a coonhound mix, but I guess city people don't have hunting dogs. But he's never heard anything in his life. He'll greet strangers at the door and wag his tail wildly as he barks. He stood back there for a bit and whined a few times. I ignored him. It was probably a squirrel. But then he started growling. A sound I'll never forget. It sent terror straight through me, and I sat alone in the dark. I had only ever felt that fear once, when a mountain lion screamed and I realized I was powerless against nature. But that's a story for a different thread. The point is, these sounds are designed to scare you. And it petrified me. I was frozen and wanted to wimp out, to hide, to call the cops, but I realized if someone was out there, they'd for sure see my phone light and know where I was. So while my dog stayed stationed at the back door, I talked myself up enough to move off the couch and investigate, still scared out of my mind. I slunk into the kitchen and grabbed the kitchen knife, one of the only utensils I had. Thanks, Ma. And crept back to the kitchen window. I was squatting amongst the cabinets, so I couldn't be seen from any windows, bouncing a little to try and gear myself to peel back the blinds. My brain was telling me irrational things, horror stories that I had read come to life. To be real, I was ready to bitch out. I'm not a brave person. I was in communications, for shit's sake. Pretty far from any life-threatening situation. Well, not one that involves people at my fucking house. In my one safe fucking space, my hideout, my protection from anything outside wanting in. I've always been afraid of home invasion. It stems from an incident that happened when I was younger, and really isn't worth mentioning further. Point is, if someone dares to enter my safe space, it's not safe anymore. I thought I couldn't get more scared at that moment, but then I saw a male figure in my backyard, and my heart jumped. He wasn't very far from the window I was looking out of. He was bold enough to not wear anything over his head. I saw the blonde hair in the moonlight. It only took me a few seconds to recognize a security salesman in the dark. He was on the edge of my porch, watching my back door, watching my dog. I jumped up quickly, climbed over the bar counter, and turned on the lights as I went towards the back door to let my still growling dog out in hopes that he'd at least get rid of the man, if not injure him. No dice. As soon as the lights came on, he had just enough time to jump to the low part of the fence to safety before my dog even got off the porch. I didn't sleep that night. My dog sat on the futon with me, calm as could be, having done his job. The next morning I filed a police report, but I couldn't tell him his name or what company he was with, having lost the card he gave me. They sent some patrols through the area, and I found out that all legit salesmen would have an ID upon request. That night I had 2 friends stay with me, ready for him to come back to either A, try to rob me, or commit more nefarious acts, or B, try to scare me into home security. He didn't come back, and I haven't seen him since. My dog hasn't growled like that either, but I'm terrified for the next time I'll hear it.
In the middle of the night, my sister was awoken by a light tapping on the window next to her bed. Facing the window, she saw a man's head looking down at her. Just his head and shoulders were visible, meaning he was on his knees by the window. "Hey," he said with a smile. "Let me in." My sister said she just shook her head, terrified of this man, and he continued, "Come on, let me in. It'll be fun." She refused to say anything back to this man, but was too scared to move as his smile grew wider. "You won't get in trouble. Just let me in." His tapping became more aggressive as she remained silent, and his head kept nodding towards the front door, gesturing for her to come and open it. After a few minutes of this man's attempts at persuading her to open the front door and let him in, she built up the courage to run from her room to my parents, screaming for them to wake up. Her screaming was violent enough to send my father running out the front door. The man was long gone, and her experience was chalked up as a nightmare by my parents. But even now, in her early 30s, she's still adamant it was not a nightmare, and that she saw a real man, a predator, trying to persuade a little girl to let him inside her home.
My Plenty of Fish Nightmare by Some Girl from Saskatchewan. Read by 242 Reads. When I just finished college, I was living in a 1-bedroom townhouse split. I met a guy on Plenty of Fish, and at the time, I wasn't exactly smart about my online digital footprint. Not like I've changed, but at least now I'm not as ridiculous. Anyways, he seemed like a decent guy. He was really good looking, said he had a good job, nice teeth, don't you judge me, and looked like he cared about his personal health. All things I would typically look for in a guy. I'm not a shallow human, but I like to be presentable, and if I'm with someone, I would like them to take care about being presentable in a business environment also. After about a week of chatting online, we agreed to meet. We met in a restaurant downtown, which was really far from where I lived. When I got there, I noticed him standing at the door. We sat down to eat, and the evening went great. At the end of the date, we said goodbye, and I got in my car and began to drive away. I realized right away he was following me. Because of the distance to my house, I wasn't immediately scared because it's a big city. Maybe he'll turn off the freeway? He didn't. My exit was coming up and I decided not to take it. I kept driving. I circled the entire city on the freeway and he stayed right behind me. I was starting to panic a bit, so I decided to go to my friend's house instead of mine. And when I pulled out the exit, I noticed he didn't. So I had a little bit of a moment to breathe and decide, okay, hoop it, I'll just go home. I took the off-ramp back onto the freeway and began going back to my exit. I got home and showered and was getting ready for bed and started feeling dumb because, was that really him? Am I overreacting? Do I ask him if he was following me? Just a number of things were racing through my overactive imagination. Or so I thought. I decided I was going to message him and just said, had a good time, good night. And when I started typing, all of a sudden a message came through my phone of a picture of my car outside my house. I nearly died. My heart jumped out of my chest. I started shaking. I didn't know what to say. And he texted me and said, I didn't know you lived across the street from me. I've met my neighbors, and not once have I met him. There is a huge apartment complex kitty corner to the townhouse, so maybe that's where he lived. I don't know. I popped up and went to look outside, and there he was, standing there outside, like he was waiting for me. I opened the door and he asked if he could come in and if I wanted to still hang out. I told him I was exhausted and I'd rather just crash out as it had been a long day. The next morning, I woke up to go to work and my windshield had been smashed, my car was keyed, my back 2 tires were slashed, and as I noticed the damage to my vehicle, the guy came out of his car with 2 coffees and is like, "Oh, I thought I'd surprise you with a morning coffee." So again, I'm freaking out. I called the cops and reported the damage to my vehicle. This guy offered to drive me, and something in my gut was like, don't get in that car. So I called my boss, told him the situation, and explained I wasn't going to be there until after the police came. This guy just hung out the whole time. By the way, when the police finally got there, this guy was acting really suspicious. He walked away and was hiding on the other side of his car. I filed the report and the police basically said, "Hope you have insurance," and were on their way to leave. They pulled around the corner and all I heard was the sirens on the cop's light turn on, and the cops scream, "Freeze, put your hands in the air and get down on your knees." I looked and the cop's got his gun drawn at this guy and this dude is on the ground getting arrested. I spoke with a cop after he got into the back and he explained he was wanted for stalking, breach of prohibition, assault with a deadly weapon, fraud, and aggravated sexual assault. I was shocked. It took me a couple days to get over the hypothetical situations that I could have been in. About a week later, I was on my way out the door to work, and guess who was sitting on my driveway? We live in Canada, so essentially you're released on condition until you go to jail. I told him I was late for work, but I'd call him when I was done work. I never went to work that day. I went and found a new apartment in another area of the city. I also changed my phone number and hired my friend's husband and his friend to go pack my apartment up and move it to their place for a month, and then move it to my new place because I was so scared this dude would follow them while moving. So, that's my horror story of the first time I used Plenty of Fish.
This is a weird one, and if it wasn't for the sheer number of people that have witnessed the same thing, I'd have thought me and my mother were just making it up, trying to convince ourselves something weird was happening rather than we were just misplacing things and going crazy. So it started with small things moving around the house, stuff that is easily explained. Our fridge magnets would turn upside down, items wouldn't be in the places we thought we left them. The strangest one was a videotape my mother and I turned the house upside down looking for, only to find it a couple of days later in a drawer on top of things we'd searched through before. At this point, we were just questioning our own sanity, not thinking there was anything supernatural happening. Then, my mother was decorating the house, and she was on a ladder trying to put up some wallpaper. The ladder started to slightly shake, to the point where she had to come down because she felt unsafe. She didn't think her own weight on the ladder would have done this, and it seemed fairly sturdy, but she still didn't question this until a little later. More and more, what you could describe as poltergeist activity began happening. We would hear loud banging when nobody else was in the house, but it sounded like it was coming from the walls. I could hear doors opening and closing when everyone else in the house was asleep. A picture frame fell and shattered in the middle of the night, and even though I was wide awake, I didn't hear it, but it woke my mother up. We were less able to explain these instances. Eventually, my mother began to notice things out of the corner of her eye. She told me that she had seen a little girl in the house who appeared to be wearing a happy birthday badge, indicating she was 5 years old. It only got weirder from there. When my niece had been a small child, she used to sleep at the house during my brother's time with her. We used to play together in the garden, and we would play catch with a beach ball. My niece used to throw the ball to the side rather than straight at me, and then she would giggle. At the time, I thought she was doing it to annoy me, throwing it so she knew I wouldn't be able to catch it. More recently, now my niece is an adult, we talked about how she used to stay with us, and she asked me a strange question. Who was that little girl that we used to play with? I told her I didn't remember any little girl. There was a little girl who lived close by. She used to come and play catch with us in the garden. Memories of her throwing the ball to the side flooded back to me, and I called my mother to confirm I wasn't going mad. My mother echoed my thoughts. There was no little girl. But my niece clearly remembered that she was throwing the ball to the little girl who couldn't catch it. That's why she was laughing. The little girl never caught the ball, and my niece found it hilarious at the time. When I told her how I remembered what happened, she turned pale. To me, she was throwing the ball into thin air. But it didn't end there. More recently, my brother had another child with a woman he met in another country. His son didn't speak much English, as he was raised speaking his native tongue, and he hadn't heard many English-sounding names while growing up. When this son came to visit us, he stayed with my mother in that same house. One night after putting him to bed, my mother heard him giggling. She went upstairs to see why he was awake, and he seemed to be talking to himself. She asked him who he was talking to. The response was Debbie, a little girl who he had seen in the bedroom.
To preface this story, I was young, a teenager, maybe 18 or 19 years old, and I had no idea what me and my father were getting into. So my father owned 3 businesses and was actively dating his business partner without my knowledge. He was also providing to her without my knowledge. She also made advances on me, which kind of creeped me out. She would buy us all food, and at first I was super grateful, but then I started becoming nervous as she wanted to be alone with me a lot. My father ended up getting married, but told me not to tell her out of fear that she would be upset and have a nervous breakdown. So one day she came to my job and demanded to see my father, which I told her he wasn't there. She screamed at me and said we would soon regret it. Due to the disturbing nature of this threat, I called the cops, and all they did was take my name, but really didn't look into it. So fast forward, I came home around 12 midnight and I had just came from my second job. Dead tired from school. I worked, ate pizza, and crashed in my bed. It had to be at least 3 in the morning when I heard my door open. And at first, I didn't move because I assumed it was my calico cat, Misty, pawing at my door. And she liked to sleep with me. When I groaned her name and she didn't answer, it struck me strange, but I wasn't worried until I felt a presence standing over me. I quickly woke up and discovered my father's ex in our house above me, crazy-eyed. She was screaming, saying how she would get her revenge on my father, how he wronged her. I quickly rolled out of my bed and ran past her and called the authorities. She openly tried to fight my father's wife and tried to stab my dad. The police came and arrested her on the spot. That was the scariest shit I've ever seen. Though I'm glad I won't be seeing her again. Now I sleep with a blade next to my bed and a taser. Please be careful, as you never know who may pay you a visit. And to my father's ex, let's never meet again.
One of my first posts on here. But I've always had a fascination with the dark and mysterious aspects of life. So I figured I'd tell about some of the strange characters I've met on the road. This one was by far the weirdest. I used to be an OTR truck driver that drove with another guy. This job only lasted a year in total. But within that year, I had some strange encounters on the road. One of which was another truck driver that decided to take off his shirt at a fuel lane and proceed to wash himself with windshield wiper fluid during one of my breaks. Despite some of the weird people or off-kilter types, there was one guy that creeped me out more than anyone else. He's one of the main reasons I stopped driving in the first place. The interaction happened at night. We were driving a load to California set to arrive the next day at night. I had arrived at a rest area in Arkansas at about 3:30 a.m. Just having finished my drive time and getting set to take my 10-hour break. It was dark, light rain was pouring, and the rest area in particular was down a bit from the highway and completely encircled by trees. Perfect spooky atmosphere for the interaction I was about to have. I clocked out for the night, did a quick scan around, and then hopped out and locked the truck. The rest area was pretty quiet. A few sparse cars in the parking lot, and a couple of semis that decided to sleep here for the night. An assortment of benches around with some canopies over them to shield them from the rain. I was walking to the restroom to take a leak when I saw a man in the dark smoking a cigarette and sitting on one of the benches. Walking past, my anxiety raised a bit, but not enough to set up alarm, and decided to keep heading to the restroom. I handled my business, washed my hands, and headed back to the truck. The man was still seated in his original spot, but his body language told me he was now watching me. His face was shrouded in shadow due to the overhead light, but his whole body turned as I walked past. Getting slightly paranoid, I picked up the pace back to the truck, hopped inside, and quickly locked the door. Figuring the worst of my anxiety was over, I decided to turn the radio back on to finish one of the comedy shows I was listening to and finish the beef jerky I had bought from earlier. As I raised the jerky up to my mouth, my periphery sensed some movement and I looked up at the benches for that man. He was no longer sitting at the bench, but was now perched underneath the light post about 10 feet from my truck. My anxiety flooded back and sensed something was off. Something about his posture was bothering me, like I could sense this man didn't have good intentions. I shut off the radio at this moment and stared back. This guy didn't move at all. The shadows covered most of his face, but I could tell he was staring in at me. This stare down felt like it lasted for 10 minutes straight. He didn't even lift his arm to take a drag from his cigarette that was still lit. Feeling like this situation was too strange, I called to my co-driver who was sleeping in the cab. "Ugh, what dude?" he said, still waking up. "Hey man, I finished my shift, but there's also this dude staring down me and the truck outside." I heard him move about and peek through the cab curtain. "What dude?" I looked back, and the dude was gone. I freaked out and scanned all over. And when I looked in the driver's side mirror, the man was now walking slowly towards the back of the truck, cigarette in mouth. "Looks like he's walking around the truck," I said. "What the fuck? Really? What side is he on?" my co-driver said, confused. At this point, the dude had circled the back of the truck and was now walking up the passenger side. "He's on the passenger side now," I said. I slid over to the passenger side and grabbed my knife off the dashboard just in case. My co-driver finally saw him walking up the passenger side mirror. The guy stopped right by the passenger door and started peering into the lower window of the passenger door. Freaked out, I yelled out, "What the fuck do you want, asshole?" which made the man leap back and step on his tiptoes to try and peer into the higher window. He could see me looking at him now. He had to be in his 50s or 60s. Skinny-ish man, with bright blue buggered out eyes. He had a deranged look on his face, like confusion mixed with malice. My co-driver said, "Can we help you?" Upon hearing that there's two of us in the truck, the man abruptly straightened up and walked off, leaving both of us as confused as ever. My co-driver threw on his clothes and sat in the driver's side. I recalled my experience with the guy up to that point, and we just sat and watched him. We noticed that every single time a new vehicle arrived, he would walk to whatever light post was closest to the new arrival and stand there. We sat for about 30 minutes debating whether we should call the police, since this guy didn't actually do anything besides acting like a creep. When we finally decided to make a call, we watched the man check his phone, shake his hands in frustration, and sprint back to one of the cars in the parking lot and peel off into the night. This was the last I had ever saw of him. What confuses me the most is what his intentions were. I was quite bigger than he was. If it came down to an altercation, it's likely that he'd only have the upper hand if he had a weapon. If he had plans to steal the truck, we have logs and GPS coordinates on our truck at all times. Our systems alert our fleet manager if we're driving off when we have no time on our clocks. Plus, what the fuck was that guy doing out at 3:30 AM in a shady rest area? My best theory is that rest areas aren't watched very often by police. and this one happens to be out of view due to the tree coverage between the rest area and the highway. This guy seemed to have picked this spot for a particular reason. As for what plans he had after, abduction, theft, violence, I'm not clear. I'd like to hear what you guys think and what interactions you've had. But to that creepy fucker lurking around in the Arkansas rest area in the middle of the night, let's not meet again.
In 2009, the company I used to work for was acquired by a larger business located in Kansas. When I think of Kansas now, it's not like what most people quickly imagine. Images of Dorothy and Toto on the farm and a twister in the background. No, for me it's something completely different. Something that actually still makes me uneasy when I do think about it. Me being slightly naive and ignorant, I was not very familiar with the Midwest at all. I'm just a simple guy from the Northeast who vacationed more outside of the USA than inside of it. One of the things I learned when traveling to Kansas a few times, while going back and forth between our old New Jersey office and the new Kansas office, was that when a business's office property had a large enough open area, many times it would also contain a cornfield. Apparently, if the business has a large enough area of land, they can plant corn and use it for some kind of tax benefits. Of course, once I learned this fact, that's when I noticed cornfields almost everywhere. It wasn't just on farms as I had presumed. There were as many fields on the properties of office buildings as there were the farms. In fact, the hotel I was staying at for the business trip also had a field on the side of its property. In the rear of the hotel was a small patio area that contained a few round patio tables leading to a small fenced-in pool. Beyond the pool was a large lawn, which reminded me a lot of where I lived in New Jersey. This area was about 50 yards or so wide as well as it was long, and beyond that was a two-way street intersecting the hotel's property and another large cornfield. Now, I don't remember what day it was, but it was the middle of the week, so we'll just say Wednesday night. I smoked cigarettes at the time, so at night, after returning from the Kansas office, I would sit back there, smoke a few, and have a few drinks, and usually sit and bullshit with my coworker Rob. He was on the trip with me this time. We had been at the hotel for a few days already, and happened to meet a guy the first night we checked in. He worked at the hotel, but would occasionally come outside when he was on break. He'd head out, have a cigarette with us, and ask us about New Jersey. Simple, small talk. He would also tell us about what it was like in Kansas. He was our age and was a cool enough guy just to shoot the shit with. As I said earlier, I don't exactly know what day it was, but it wasn't too late, but it was fairly dark. Somewhere around 9 p.m., 9:30 maybe. I was outside alone that night and had just hung up the phone with my wife. I decided to smoke one more cigarette, have one more drink, and was going to call it a night. As I sat there, a few moments later, Rob stepped outside. He asked me for a cigarette, and we ended up hanging outside for the next hour or so. Rob sat at the table with his back facing the road and the cornfield. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but every so often, out of the corner of my eye, I would see something by the road, directly at the edge of the cornfield. Eventually, Rob noticed as I continued to stare over his shoulder, finally asking what I was looking at. I think I keep seeing something walking over there by the field. I pointed and he turned, but he didn't see anything. He told me I was bugging out. Dude, have another drink, he laughed, taking a drag of his cigarette. I agreed, shrugged it off, and grabbed my drink. And just as soon as I took a sip, there was an incredibly loud howling sound from the area. I thought I was seeing that dark figure. It wasn't the sound of a person howling, but also it wasn't the sound of an animal either. I can't really describe it, but it literally made me jump. Rob did too. In fact, he dropped his cigarette, turned back around asking, what the fuck was that? Now, we're both staring intently at the road, gazing into the field. And at first there was nothing. No movements. No sounds. Just the high-pitched squeal of crickets. Crickets so damn loud like they were screaming directly into my ear. They were the most prominent sound in that otherwise deafening silence. But what followed a moment later was the blood-curdling howl we had just heard. Then it was Rob who saw it first. I can still remember the look on his face, his eyes widening to the point of seeing all the white inside them. Holy shit, is that what you saw? He pointed his finger. I followed where his finger aimed, and in the dim outer glow of the street lamp I saw it. The thing I had briefly seen earlier, but this time, it was out in the open. Yeah, that's it. Holy shit, is it a person? We continued looking at the thing, but it just stood there. Whatever it was tall and lanky. It was wearing either a hoodie or had long, dark hair covering its shoulders. It was completely dark, and with its head, we could see it was cocked, hanging over its left shoulder. It was difficult to make out in the dark, as it was also quite a distance away. However, it just stood there, just outside the full glow of the street lamp, motionless, staring at us. I figured it had to have known we saw it with the way it just stood there, staring at Rob and I. Had I have been right next to it, I probably only would have heard its breathing. Other than that, it just stood, frozen, as still as the night. What seemed like minutes, but was probably no more than 10 to 15 seconds, it began to slowly walk backward, disappearing into the cornfield. Rob and I both continued to stare in the direction for another few moments. It was Rob who spoke first. Alright, dude, that was fucking weird. You can stay out here if you want, but I'm going back inside. I'm going to sleep. I'll catch you tomorrow. I agreed. I didn't know if it was just somebody pranking us or what, but I didn't really feel like finding out, especially when my wife told me, be careful and don't do anything stupid, when I had spoken to her earlier that night. I grabbed my drink, my pack of cigarettes, and walked back inside. The next morning, Rob and I had a meeting at the office. We did our work and talked about it briefly, but not as much as I would have thought. And maybe it was just me being on alert because of my wife and my 9-month-old daughter at home, but what we saw that night before was still on my mind. A lot. Later that evening, when we were back at the hotel for the rest of the night, I ran into Marcus, the guy that worked at the hotel. He was pulling one of those large brass concierge luggage carts from outside. I waved to him hello. He motioned for me to walk over to him. Hey, did you and Rob hang out last night? I went out there around 10:30, but you guys weren't there. I told him we had been out, but we went inside early, and he asked if it was because we had to leave so early for the office. I wasn't sure if I should say anything, but decided what the hell. I then proceeded to tell him what we heard and saw outside last night. It was like a ghost walked over Marcus's grave. He stopped pulling the cart, looked at me with an expression of surprise and terror. Damn, you've seen it too? It hit me like a punch to my chest. I felt my heart drop, my stomach felt warm and loose. What do you mean saw it too? Marcus gave me a nervous laugh and told me that he himself had never seen it, but he's heard about other guests that have asked the hotel staff about a man by the cornfield. Immediately, my mind conjured up the image of the man or thing we saw standing just outside that dim glow of the streetlight the night before. I remember the chill that ran down my spine as he told me. In fact, I feel it as I'm telling you all this now. Marcus went on, telling me he's worked there for about 3 years. He then told me at least 2 or 3 guests every year asked the hotel staff about it. His manager, I believe her name was Laura, has been working there for over 10 years, and she's heard about it too, from her previous boss. Apparently, whatever or whoever it is has been seen at the edge of that road, lurking by the cornfield for well over a decade, which is pretty terrifying if you ask me. Needless to say, Rob and I decided to just hang out in the lobby of the hotel the rest of the trip. We never ventured back to the patio the last few days we were there. And that trip happened to be the final time we would ever go back to Kansas. Only a few months later, the company that had acquired us shut down the New Jersey office, laying off the entire branch. To this day, I never found out anything more about the thing that lurked at the edge of that cornfield. And believe it or not, I don't think I ever want to find out what it was.
I'm in London, UK. We're in a Tier 4 lockdown. Stay in your home, only go out for the shopping trips or exercise, and no mixing with people outside of your own home or support bubble, etc., etc. With the mutating strain of COVID-19 rampaging through London, hospital beds nearly at capacity and death toll rising, it made sense to stay indoors as much as possible. But every human being has a breaking point, and mine was 8 days of wandering around my one-bedroom apartment. I had talked myself out on Zoom and ran out of conversations to talk to myself about. At 10 p.m. New Year's Eve, I decided to get some air, allowed within the rules of Tier 4, and go for a quick walk around the perimeter of the local park, all on main roads, and it takes about 40 minutes. The plan was to stop at a local grocery store and pick up a bottle of red wine on the way back. Stepped out with mask firmly affixed, and I started walking. One thing that I was not prepared for was the eerily empty and almost silent streets. It was just below freezing, and I decided to hustle and cut through some side streets first. On hindsight, that was a big mistake. Navigating myself through very quiet side streets, I neared the park when I saw a van, Mercedes Sprinter size, turn in and rapidly approach me. Deciding to let them pass before crossing, I came to a halt. The van began to slow as it approached me. I could see the cab was occupied by two men between the ages of 25 and 40 of age. And then it stopped. Window rolled down and one man leaned out. "Hey friend, we're lost. Can you tell me the directions to XX station?" The accent was not from the UK, and I'm not going to state its origin, as I'm not going to get into stereotypes. Alarm bells began to ring out immediately. What was a van doing at this time, and why directions to the local train station? I mean, in the middle of a Tier 4 lockdown. The van had stopped on the side of the road that was facing me. I stepped back a few paces and gave directions very quickly. "I do not understand at all. I think best if you show us." With that, he opens his door, and the side door to the van opens, to reveal another two men. I just turned and ran, down the side street that I had emerged from. "Shit, take the van around. I'll follow him." Knowing that these guys were fitter and younger than I am, a foot race to my apartment building was out of the question. The only advantage I had was a head start, and hopefully local knowledge of the streets. The side street leads into a large street that has homes with larger hedges. I ran past a few homes and entered the front garden of a house that had the most imposing and opaque hedge. It was unlit, and I ducked down. Lucky for me, that house did not have a motion sensor light. Within a few seconds, I could hear footsteps, and they went past me and stopped. I peeked through the hedge vegetation, a very limited view, to see the man who had asked for directions. He was a few houses down from me and on the opposite side of the street. He was looking around. And then the sound of the vehicle. I thought, oh no, the van. Lucky for me, it was a car. The man looked at his phone, looked around, pretending he was checking something, and then walked off, leaving the residential street as quickly as possible. The car continued its way. I waited another 10 minutes, sitting behind the hedge in the front garden, practicing an explanation if the house lights were to come on. The house stayed unlit, and after my allotted time I rose and quickly walked back to my apartment building, keeping to the shadows and reacting to every sound. I made it back, bolted the front door. Only when I sat down did I understand what I just avoided. All of this for some air and a bottle of red? I'd poured myself a black coffee and debated calling the police. But, I mean, what could I say? Had anything really happened that they could act on? I mean, initiation of being kidnapped or being in danger is not enough evidence. Plus, being a man, this would not really be a priority, especially on a night that they would be overstretched on. I just waited in the New Year's, realizing that I had a very lucky escape, and that I should stock up on red wine at a more decent time.
This happened about 40 years ago. I was 20 at the time. The first time I met the guy who would become my grocery store stalker, he was standing outside the store, collecting money for the Salvation Army Christmas time donations. I'm a fairly friendly person, so I like to say hi to people who work at places I frequent, just to be nice. This guy was a kid around my age, very tall with a mild resemblance to Lurch from the Addams Family. Big dark circles under the eyes, short black hair, and a kind of vacant look in his eyes. I chatted with him for maybe all of 2 minutes. Just idle chit-chat about the weather and whatnot, nothing particularly memorable or interesting, and then waved goodbye and went home. Little did I know, that single moment would be the start of something that would have me genuinely afraid. About 4 or 5 months passed by, and I hadn't seen him again in that whole while. Then one day, as I was grocery shopping with a friend, while we were chatting, she suddenly got very quiet and kind of recoiled backwards, looking behind me. I turned around to see this guy, who had to be at least 6'4", towering over me not 8 inches from my body. He said hi, and told me he remembered me from that December when I had talked to him before. Then he asked for my number. I, being young and never having experienced this type of interaction before, told him I didn't have my number memorized, but I would write his down and text him later. I kind of half-waved my phone at him, pointing out my at-the-time boyfriend, whose picture was my wallpaper, making a point to even say it. "Oh look, that's my boyfriend." I hoped this would clue the guy in, but no such luck. He told me his number, which immediately upon getting I blocked, without letting him get my phone number. However, what really made my blood run cold was what he said after I put my phone away. He leaned in real close, and in a low voice he whispered, "Whatever I text you is for your eyes only." At this point, I started to feel genuinely uncomfortable. "Yeah, sure. Whatever. Nice talking to you, but we gotta get back to shopping now?" I grabbed my friend and dragged her off, shooting a panicked look at her and asking why she didn't bail me out. Apparently he'd scared her too, with his getting so close to me, and she just didn't know what to do. I want to make it clear, I'm not exactly a small girl. I'm 5'8" and solidly built. I can certainly handle myself, and I very rarely feel intimidated or small in the presence of anyone, male or female. But this guy was so big he made me feel tiny and scared. In the months that would follow, he would make me feel truly frightened. I of course hoped that this creepy interaction would be the very last time I saw him, but that was unfortunately not the case. After that initial meeting with him saying that creepy thing about his text being for my eyes only, it seemed like I ran into him every single time I would go to the store. No matter what checkout lane I was in, he always seemed to appear right at the end of it when I was finished shopping, and every time I was in the store, I would always notice him out of the corner of my eye, watching me, no matter what area I happened to be in. One time I even caught him following me out to my car. At that point I got scared, and decided to say something to the managers. After letting the managers know what was going on, they assured me they would tell him not to talk to me. After that, he would never speak to me, but I would constantly see him following me around the store at a distance every time I would go there. It got so bad, and I felt so frightened that I started to be afraid to go to the store at all. I'm one of those stubborn people, though, who refuses to be intimidated by someone to the point where I'll stop doing something. I had hoped that maybe it was just a coincidence that he was following me. After all, it was a really big store, and maybe he just had things to do that just happened to be in the same areas I was shopping in, so I started to pay closer attention to my surroundings. Once I really started paying attention, though,
I realized that every single time I was there, I would constantly see him, following me around the areas of the store I was in. During my last encounter with him, I went up to the store to grab just 2 or 3 items I needed for dinner that night, and I saw him standing outside when I got there. He had his back to me, so I quickly ran inside hoping he wouldn't see me. Unfortunately though, a few minutes later, I saw him at the very back of the store, and items in hand. I immediately made a beeline towards the front. As soon as I got near the checkout, I ducked behind one of the shelf displays and watched carefully at the front of the store to see if he would appear, and he did. I watched as he scanned up and down the checkout, and when he didn't see me there, I saw him walk outside. At this point, I quickly ran to the nearest open cashier, rang up my items, and stuck my head out the door to look for him. I didn't see him there immediately, so I started trying to make my way back to where I was parked. I had parked a ways away, near the side of the store where a bunch of other small stores and restaurants were lined up, but as I was making my way towards my car, I realized I saw him standing and waiting by the entrance I had first used to enter the store through. I ducked behind a pillar immediately, hoping he didn't see me. I watched very carefully from behind the pillar as he constantly scanned the parking lot. Obviously, he couldn't find me. After a minute or two, he started to walk towards the direction of the parking lot in front of the store, and so I took that opportunity to make a run for it to my car as soon as he was far enough away that I felt safe. As soon as I got into my car, I locked the doors, and to my horror when I looked up, he was standing there, only 15 feet away, with a shopping cart right in front of him. I knew he followed me. He knew I knew as well. I fully believe he chased after me, and when I made it to my car, he grabbed the nearest cart to make it look like he was only collecting them from the parking lot. I just remember feeling absolutely terrified in that moment. I went home and immediately told my grandfather what happened. I began crying and shaking, and my grandfather told me to get in the car. We were going to settle this once and for all. He and I drove up to the store in his car, and he walked me in and demanded we speak with the managers immediately, both of them. When the managers arrived at customer service, he asked me to tell them what had been happening, and demanded that they ensure he left me alone, or he would involve the police. The managers swore up and down they would take care of it. As far as I know, he wasn't fired immediately, because my friend who first encountered him with me when this whole thing began told me she would see him from time to time when she was there by herself, but that any time I went with her, she would never see him. I fully believe he knew whenever I was there, only this time, instead of stalking me, he avoided me. Eventually everyone who knew the situation stopped seeing him there, so I think he may have gotten fired or moved on from that store. Either way, I haven't had any issues since, but I've never in my life felt so afraid of another human being as I did that day, seeing him make eye contact with me in the parking lot as I frantically locked my car doors. It still creeps me out to think he was watching me so closely every time I entered the store that he could so easily avoid or follow me whenever he wanted.
Hi, thanks for watching the video. I really appreciate it. If you want to send me a story to read, feel free to do so. My email is in the description of the video. And if you want to follow me on my social media, just to get updates or maybe to talk, the links and info for my Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram accounts are also in the description. And finally, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And turn that bell on to be notified for upcoming surprises. And remember, your fear feeds me.